Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey to a place that once controlled the world's wealth from a collection of muddy islands that most people today would consider uninhabitable. Picture this. What if I told you that a city built on over 100 tiny islands, connected only by wooden bridges, once held more power than the British Empire at its peak? What if I told you that this floating city controlled 90% of all trade between East and West for nearly 1,000 years? And what if I told you that the same tourists who flock there today for selfies and gondola rides are walking through the remains of what historians call the most successful commercial empire in human history? Welcome to the real Venice. Not the Venice of romance novels and Instagram photos, but the Venice that made medieval kings tremble with fear. Now, before we dive into this incredible story together, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we're exploring tonight. I'm curious too, where are you listening from right now? Are you tucked into bed in California, maybe taking a late night walk in New York, or perhaps it's already morning where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. I love connecting with fellow history lovers from around the world. And here's a little tip for tonight's journey. Dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for some gentle background sound, and let your mind wander back in time with me. We're about to discover how a group of desperate refugees created something the world had never seen before. So let's settle in, close our eyes, and travel back to a time when Venice wasn't just a city. It was the beating heart of the civilized world. Now I want you to imagine New York City for a moment. Think about Wall Street, the towering skyscrapers, the endless stream of yellow cabs, the millions of people rushing through Times Square every day. New York is powerful, right? It's the financial capital of the world, a city that never sleeps, a place where dreams are made and fortunes are built overnight. But here's what might blow your mind. Medieval Venice made New York look like a small-town garage sale. When Venice was at its peak in the 15th century, it controlled more wealth per capita than any city has ever achieved, including modern-day New York, London, or Tokyo. According to economic historian Carlo Cipolla, in his groundbreaking work, Before the Industrial Revolution, Venice's per capita income in 1500 was equivalent to about $45,000 in today's money. That's medieval money, folks. No electricity, no internet, no Amazon Prime, just pure raw medieval capitalism. But here's the thing that really gets me. Venice wasn't supposed to exist at all. The story begins in the year 452 AD, and trust me, it reads like something straight out of a disaster movie. Picture the most terrifying scene you can imagine, entire cities burning on the horizon, the thunder of thousands of horses' hooves getting closer by the hour, and families grabbing whatever they could carry as they fled for their lives. The villain in our story, a man whose very name still sends chills down historians' spines, Attila the Hun. Now, you might know Attila from history class as that guy who gave the Romans a really bad time, but let me paint you a more vivid picture. Attila wasn't just any barbarian leader. He was what the Romans called the Scourge of God. His army was a tsunami of destruction that swept across Europe like nothing the world had ever seen. According to the Roman historian Priscus, who actually met Attila face to face, this wasn't just warfare, it was systematic annihilation. Cities that had stood for centuries simply vanished. Aquileia, once one of the wealthiest cities in the Roman Empire, was so thoroughly destroyed by Attila's forces that, as the historian Jordanes wrote, scarce a trace of it afterward appeared. We're talking about a city that was home to over 100,000 people, roughly the size of modern-day Green Bay, Wisconsin, completely wiped off the map. So imagine you're a Roman citizen living in what's now northern Italy. You wake up one morning and the entire horizon is black with smoke. Your neighbours are loading whatever they can onto carts, and everyone is saying the same thing. The Huns are coming. The Huns are coming. What do? Where do you run when the most feared army in the world is breathing down your neck? This is where our story gets really interesting, because the answer was absolutely insane. These desperate refugees, thousands and thousands of families, decided to run into a place that every sane person considered a death trap: the Venetian lagoon. We're talking about a maze of marshy islands, tidal flats, and muddy channels that even experienced fishermen avoided during storms. It was a place where you could easily get lost and die of exposure, where the tides could change your safe path into a watery grave in a matter of hours. But here's what I find absolutely fascinating. According to the Chronicle of John the Deacon, written around 1000 AD, these weren't just random desperate people. Many of these refugees were wealthy Roman citizens, successful merchants, skilled craftsmen, and even minor nobility. These were people who had comfortable lives, beautiful homes, and established businesses, and they gave it all up to live in a swamp. Can you imagine that decision? It's like if everyone in Manhattan suddenly decided to abandon their penthouses and move to the Florida Everglades because they heard the zombie apocalypse was coming. It sounds completely crazy, right? But here's the thing, and this is what gives me goosebumps every time I think about it. It worked. Those muddy, seemingly worthless islands that everyone else saw as uninhabitable wasteland. These refugees looked at them and saw something completely different. They saw natural fortresses. They saw a place where cavalry, the medieval equivalent of tanks, was completely useless. They saw a maze that only they would know how to navigate. According to archaeological evidence studied by Professor Stefano Gaspari of the University of Venice, the first permanent settlements in the lagoon began appearing around 453 AD, just 1 year after Attila's invasion. But these weren't desperate makeshift camps. Oh no. These early Venetians were already thinking like the brilliant strategic minds they would become famous for. They chose their islands carefully. Rialto, which would later become the commercial heart of Venice, was selected because it was one of the highest points in the lagoon, safe from all but the most extreme tides. Torcello was chosen because it had access to fresh water and fertile soil for growing food. Each settlement was positioned for both defense and trade. But here's where the story gets really mind-blowing. Within just 50 years, these refugees had created something that had never existed in human history before. They had built a civilization on water. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Come on, lots of civilizations have built on water. What about the Netherlands? What about the floating gardens of the Aztecs? And you're right, but Venice was different. Venice wasn't just adapting to water. Venice was using water as a weapon. Let me explain what I mean. The early Venetians developed something that military historians call amphibious asymmetric warfare. Sounds fancy, right? Basically, it meant they could attack anyone, anywhere along the coast, but nobody could attack them. Their enemies had to have ships to reach them, but once they got into the lagoon, they were sitting ducks. The Venetians knew every sandbar, every tidal channel, every hidden passage. It was like playing a video game where only you know the cheat codes. According to the Byzantine historian Procopius, by the year 550 AD, less than a century after fleeing from Attila, these same refugees were already so prosperous and well organized that the Byzantine Empire was asking them for military help. Think about that for a second. The most powerful empire in the world was asking a bunch of people living on muddy islands for assistance. But the real genius of early Venice wasn't military, it was economic. And this is where our refugees transformed from survivors into something much more dangerous: entrepreneurs. You see, while the rest of Europe was busy fighting over land, who controlled which fields, which forests, which mountains, the Venetians had a completely different idea. They realized that in a world where communication was slow and transportation was dangerous, information was the most valuable commodity of all, and they were sitting right in the middle of the best information highway in the world, the Mediterranean Sea. Ships from Constantinople brought news of politics in the east. Traders from North Africa carried information about gold and ivory markets. Merchants from Alexandria gossiped about spice prices and silk supplies. All of these people had to pass through or near Venetian waters, and the Venetians made sure they were the most welcoming, most helpful, most informed hosts these traders had ever encountered. But here's the brilliant part, and this is something that would make any modern Wall Street trader jealous. The Venetians never just provided services, they collected information. Every conversation, every rumour, every piece of gossip about markets, politics and opportunities was carefully catalogued and analysed. By the year 600 AD, according to economic records preserved in the Venetian state archives, Venice had already established regular trading relationships with cities as far away as Damascus, Alexandria, and even places in India that most Europeans couldn't even pronounce. And remember, we're talking about people who supposedly had nothing just 150 years earlier. This is what I love about the Venetian story. It's the ultimate immigrant success story. It's about people who lost everything, who were forced to start over in the most unlikely place imaginable, and who not only survived but thrived beyond anyone's wildest dreams. But what really sets Venice apart is that they didn't just get rich and call it a day. Oh no, these former refugees had bigger plans, much bigger plans. By the 7th century, the Venetians had begun to think of themselves not as refugees from the Roman Empire, but as the rightful inheritors of Roman greatness. They looked around at the chaos and warfare consuming the rest of Europe and said, essentially, we can do better, and that's exactly what they set out to prove. They began developing something that wouldn't be seen again until the founding of America over 1,000 years later, a republic based on commercial success rather than military conquest. A place where your success depended on how smart you were, how hard you worked, and how well you could make deals, not on who your father was or how many people you could kill in battle. It was revolutionary, literally. Now, as I'm telling you this story, I want you to think about something. How often have you heard about a group of people who lost everything, their homes, their possessions, their entire way of life, and then went on to build something even greater than what they left behind? It's rare, isn't it? Most of the time, when we hear about refugees or displaced people, the stories are about survival, about hanging on, about trying to rebuild what was lost. But the Venetians didn't try to rebuild what they had lost. They built something entirely new, something the world had never seen before, and that's just the beginning of our story. Because what these refugees created in their floating city would eventually grow into something so powerful, so wealthy, and so influential that it would reshape the entire world. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We still need to talk about how they actually built a city on water, and trust me, the engineering behind it will absolutely blow your mind. We need to explore how they went from being grateful for any shelter to demanding that the most powerful empires in the world treat them as equals. And we definitely need to discuss how they managed to create the most sophisticated government system of the medieval world, one that the American founding fathers would study very carefully over 1,000 years later. But all of that is a story for our next part of this journey. Right now, I want you to drift off thinking about those first brave souls standing on muddy islands in 452 AD, looking out at an uncertain future and deciding that instead of just surviving, they were going to build something magnificent. Because that's exactly what they did. And in our next chapter, we're going to discover how a group of homeless refugees became the architects of one of history's most incredible civilizations. We'll explore the moment when the survivors became conquerors, when the displaced became empire builders, and when a collection of muddy islands became the center of the known world. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you in medieval Venice, where the impossible was just another day at the office. Picture this moment with me. You're standing on the mainland of northern Italy in the spring of 452 AD, and you can literally smell the smoke from burning cities carried on the wind. Every refugee who stumbles into your town tells the same terrifying story. Entire populations vanishing overnight, ancient cities reduced to ash, and an army so ruthless that even hardened Roman soldiers are throwing down their weapons and running. Now here's what I find absolutely mind-boggling about this moment in history. These people had choices. They could have fled south toward Rome, where the empire still maintained some semblance of order. They could have headed west into Gaul, where other Roman citizens were establishing new communities. They could have even tried to negotiate with the Huns. After all, Attila was known to accept tribute in exchange for mercy, but instead, thousands upon thousands of families made what might be the most counterintuitive decision in human history. They deliberately chose to move into one of the most dangerous, inhospitable environments in all of Europe. Why? What would drive educated, civilized people to abandon everything they knew and literally bet their lives on a bunch of muddy islands that experienced fishermen warned them about? The answer lies in understanding something that most history books gloss over. These weren't just panicked people running blindly from danger. These were strategic thinkers making the ultimate calculated risk. And the story of how they pulled it off reads like the greatest survival guide ever written. Let me set the scene for you properly, because I think most of us today can't really grasp the sheer terror of what was happening in 452 AD. According to the contemporary historian Prosper of Aquitaine, who was actually alive during these events, Attila's invasion wasn't like anything Europe had ever experienced before. We're not talking about typical medieval warfare here, where armies fought each other and mostly left civilians alone. This was what modern military analysts would call total war, a systematic campaign designed to completely erase civilizations from existence. Prosper describes Attila's method in chilling detail. First, the Hun cavalry would surround a city completely, cutting off all escape routes. Then, they would offer terms. Surrender everything you own, including your freedom, and you might live. Refuse, and, well, let's just say that archaeologists are still finding evidence of what happened to cities that refused. Aquileia, which I mentioned in our last conversation, wasn't just destroyed, it was methodically dismantled. According to Jordanes Getica, written in the 6th century, Attila's forces spent weeks ensuring that not a single building remained standing. They even diverted rivers to flood the ruins. The message was clear. This place never existed, and neither did anyone who lived here. But here's what really gets under your skin when you read these accounts: the speed. Modern historians like Patrick Howarth, in his book Attila, King of the Huns, calculate that Attila's army was covering nearly 30 miles per day, unheard of for a medieval military force. Cities barely had time to send warnings to their neighbours before the Huns were already at their gates. So imagine you're living in Padua or Treviso, and riders come galloping into town shouting that Aquileia, a city of 100,000 people that had stood for 6 centuries, was completely gone. Not conquered, gone. And the army responsible was less than 2 days away. What do you pack when you have maybe 6 hours to abandon your entire life? According to archaeological evidence studied by Professor Maria Cristina La Rocca from the University of Padua, the answer is fascinating. Jewelry, coins, and tools. Lots and lots of tools. The early Venetian settlements have yielded incredible amounts of Roman metalworking equipment, woodworking implements, and even architectural instruments. These people weren't just running, they were planning to rebuild. But rebuild where? And this is where the story gets really interesting. The Venetian lagoon in 452 AD wasn't the romantic canal-filled wonderland you see in movies today. According to environmental studies conducted by the Venice Institute of Marine Sciences, it was a treacherous maze of shifting sandbars, unpredictable tides, and marsh islands that could literally disappear underwater during storms. The Roman writer Cassiodorus, writing about the lagoon in the early 6th century, described it as a place where land and sea change roles with each tide, where experienced sailors lose their way, and where the very ground beneath your feet might not exist tomorrow. Sounds delightful, right? Like the world's worst vacation destination. But those desperate refugees saw something in this hostile environment that nobody else did. They saw the perfect natural fortress. And here's the brilliant part. They were absolutely right. Think about it. Attila's great advantage was mobility. His cavalry could appear anywhere, any time, and strike with overwhelming force. But cavalry is pretty useless when there's no solid ground to ride on. Ships were vulnerable because they had to follow predictable routes and could be easily trapped or sunk. But people who could navigate shallow waters, who understood tides and currents, who could literally walk on water when they needed to, those people became untouchable. The early Venetians weren't just hiding in the lagoon, they were weaponizing it. Now I know what you might be thinking. Okay, that's a great theory, but how did they actually survive out there? And that question brings us to one of the most remarkable technological achievements in medieval history, one that most people have never heard of. These refugees invented a completely new way of building cities. According to Cassiodorus, who visited the lagoon settlements around 537 AD, the Venetians had developed a construction technique that seemed to defy the laws of physics. They were building substantial wooden structures, not flimsy huts, but actual houses, workshops, and even early churches, on ground that was underwater twice a day. How? Well, this is where it gets really cool. The Venetians had discovered that if you drive wooden piles deep enough into the lagoon floor, they don't rot. They actually get harder. The combination of salt water and oxygen-free mud creates a natural preservation process that essentially turns wood into stone. According to the Venetian architect Antonio da Ponte, who studied these ancient construction methods in the 16th century, some of the original 5th century pilings were still solid enough to support buildings 1,000 years later. But here's the part that would make modern engineers jealous. They didn't just randomly stick poles in the mud and hope for the best. Oh no, these supposedly primitive refugees developed a sophisticated understanding of tidal mechanics, weight distribution, and what we now call flexible foundation systems. Dr. Daria Camufo, who has spent decades studying early Venetian construction techniques for the Italian National Research Council, found evidence that these 5th century builders were actually using principles that wouldn't be officially discovered by European engineers until the Renaissance. They understood that buildings in a tidal environment needed to move with the water, not fight against it. It's like they invented earthquake-proof architecture 1,500 years before San Francisco needed it, and the results were spectacular. Within just a few decades, according to Byzantine records preserved in the National Library of Venice, these refugee settlements had grown into thriving communities with their own markets, churches, and workshops. They weren't just surviving, they were prospering. But here's what I find absolutely fascinating. They didn't try to recreate what they had lost on the mainland. Instead, they adapted their entire way of life to their new environment. and in doing so they accidentally created something revolutionary. For example, since traditional farming was impossible on the islands, they had to import all their food, but that forced them to become traders almost immediately. Since land transportation was impossible, everything had to move by water, which made them expert sailors and shipbuilders almost by necessity. Since their communities were scattered across multiple islands, they had to develop new forms of communication and cooperation, which eventually evolved into their famous republican government. In other words, every limitation of their environment became a competitive advantage. It reminds me a lot of what happened after Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in 2005. Do you remember that? The city was devastated. Thousands of people lost everything, and many experts said it should just be abandoned. But the people who stayed didn't just rebuild, they rebuilt better. They used the disaster as an opportunity to fix problems that had existed for generations, to innovate, to create something new. That's exactly what the early Venetians did, except they had to figure it out without FEMA, without modern technology, and while still worrying that Attila might show up at any moment. Speaking of which, I'm curious. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to completely start over? Maybe you moved to a new city where you didn't know anyone, or changed careers completely, or had to rebuild after some kind of personal disaster. If so, you probably understand something about what those early Venetians felt. That weird combination of terror and excitement, that sense that you're either going to fail spectacularly or discover something amazing about yourself. Drop a comment and let me know. I'd love to hear your stories about starting over, because that's really what this is all about. The Venetians didn't just survive their catastrophe, they used it as the foundation for something extraordinary. And the more I study their story, the more I realize that their secret wasn't superior technology or military might or even luck. Their secret was adaptability. While the rest of Europe was trying to preserve the old Roman ways of doing things, the Venetians were busy inventing entirely new ways of living. While others were fighting to control traditional sources of wealth, land, crops, livestock, the Venetians were figuring out how to create wealth from nothing but location and ingenuity. And it worked. By 568 AD, less than 120 years after fleeing from Attila, these same refugees had become so successful that the Lombards, who had conquered most of northern Italy, specifically exempted the Venetian territories from their invasion. According to Paul the Deacon's History of the Lombards, the Lombard king Alboin declared that attacking the lagoon settlements would be like trying to catch fish with your bare hands. Possible in theory, but hardly worth the effort. Think about that for a moment. In just over a century, the Venetians had gone from being homeless refugees to being so formidable that conquering armies decided they weren't worth the trouble. But what really makes this story incredible isn't just that they survived, or even that they prospered. It's that they managed to create a completely new model for how human societies could work. They proved that you didn't need vast farmlands or mineral wealth or ancient bloodlines to build a great civilization. All you needed was strategic thinking, hard work, and the courage to try something that had never been done before. And that brings us to the next chapter of our story, because those clever refugees were about to do something even more audacious than building a floating city. They were about to invent a form of government so sophisticated, so balanced, and so effective that it would influence political thinkers for centuries to come, including the men who wrote the American Constitution. But that's a tale of political genius, power struggles, and the most complex election system ever devised. And I promise you, once you understand how the Venetians solved the problem of democratic governance in the medieval world, you'll never look at modern politics the same way again. What if I told you that 800 years before the American founding fathers ever picked up a quill to write the Constitution, A group of medieval merchants had already solved every single problem that would later plague modern democracies. What if I told you they created an election system so sophisticated that it makes our electoral college look like a high school student council vote? And what if I told you that this government was so effective, so perfectly balanced, that it lasted over 1,000 years, making it one of the longest-running republics in human history? Welcome to the political miracle of medieval Venice, where former refugees didn't just build houses on water, they built the most advanced democracy the world wouldn't see again for centuries. Here's the thing that absolutely blows my mind. While the rest of Europe was busy with kings who claimed divine right to rule, with feudal lords who inherited power through bloodlines, and with emperors who answered to no one but God, the Venetians looked around and said, "You know what? We think we can do this better." And then they proceeded to invent a form of government so ingenious, so carefully balanced, that political scientists today are still studying it to understand how they got it so right. Let me take you back to the late 7th century, around 697 AD, when the Venetians faced their first major political crisis. By this point, they had been successfully governing themselves through a loose confederation of island communities for over 2 centuries. But here's the problem: they were getting too successful. According to the Chronicle of John the Deacon, by the year 690, Venice controlled trade routes worth what would be equivalent to billions of dollars in today's money. They had established colonies, built a formidable navy, and their merchants were operating in cities from London to Constantinople. But all of this success created a problem they had never faced before. They needed a single leader who could speak for all of Venice in international affairs. The question was, how do you choose a leader in a community that was founded specifically to escape from the tyranny of absolute rulers? This is where the story gets really interesting, because the Venetians didn't just want to avoid tyranny, they wanted to create a system that would make tyranny literally impossible. And the solution they came up with was so brilliant, so ahead of its time, that when the American founding fathers were designing our government over 1,000 years later, they studied Venetian political theory extensively. According to political historian Frederick Lane, in his comprehensive work Venice, a Maritime Republic, the Venetians spent nearly 30 years, from 697 to 726 AD, experimenting with different forms of government. They tried direct democracy, but it was too chaotic for complex international negotiations. They tried aristocratic councils, but too many important voices were left out. They tried appointed governors, but that felt too much like the imperial system they had fled from. Finally, they invented something completely new: a constitutional republic with a head of state who had enormous ceremonial power, but was so thoroughly checked and balanced that he couldn't make any important decisions without broad consensus. They called this position the doge, from the Latin dux, meaning leader, and the way they elected him was absolutely mind-boggling. Are you ready for this? Because the Venetian election process makes our presidential campaigns look simple by comparison. First, the Great Council, which by the 13th century included over 200 members, would be randomly reduced to 30 electors through a lottery system. Those 30 would then debate and choose 9 electors. Those 9 would choose 40 electors. Those 40 would be reduced to 12 by lottery. Those 12 would choose 25 electors. Those 25 would be reduced to 9 by lottery. Those 9 would choose 45 electors. And finally, those 45 would elect the doge. I'm not making this up. According to the detailed records preserved in the Venetian state archives, this was the actual process, and it was designed to be so random and so complex that it would be virtually impossible to manipulate or corrupt. Think about the genius of this system. No single person or faction could control enough steps in the process to guarantee their candidate would win. The combination of random selection and deliberate choice meant that the final result represented genuine consensus rather than political manipulation. It's like if we elected our president by having the Electoral College selected through a series of random drawings and deliberative councils, with multiple rounds of both chance and choice built in. Actually, that's not a bad idea. Maybe we should give the Venetians a call. But the doge election was just the beginning. Once in office, the doge faced a system of checks and balances that would make James Madison weep with joy. The doge could not make any major decisions without the approval of his 6 councillors, who were elected separately. He could not leave Venice without permission from the Senate. He could not meet with foreign ambassadors alone. There always had to be witnesses from the government. He could not even open his own mail. All correspondence had to be read first by government officials to make sure he wasn't secretly negotiating with foreign powers. According to constitutional historian William Bowsmer, writing in Venice and the Defense of Republican Liberty, the Venetians had essentially created a presidency with all the dignity and none of the dangerous power. The doge was the face of Venice to the world, but the actual governing was done by a complex network of councils, committees, and elected bodies. And here's the really clever part. They made sure that power was not only divided, but constantly rotating. Most positions in the Venetian government had term limits. Many offices couldn't be held by members of the same family in consecutive terms. Some positions were chosen by lottery to ensure that wealth and connections couldn't dominate the system completely. The result? According to records analysed by historian Donald Queller in the Venetian Patriciate, Venice went over 400 years, from 1310 to 1718, without a single coup attempt, palace revolution, or violent change of government. 400 years. That's longer than the United States has existed as a nation. But wait, it gets even more impressive. The Venetians didn't just create a stable government, they created a responsive government. They invented what we now call separation of powers centuries before Montesquieu wrote about it. The Great Council handled legislation and major policy decisions. The Senate managed foreign policy and trade regulations. The Council of Ten, now here's where it gets really interesting. The Council of Ten was essentially a state security apparatus, but one that was elected and accountable to the other branches of government. Think about that for a moment. The Venetians created an intelligence service that was both effective and democratic. According to historian David Chambers, in his study The Imperial Age of Venice, the Council of Ten successfully protected Venice from foreign espionage, internal conspiracies, and political corruption for over 500 years, and they did it all while remaining answerable to elected officials. When was the last time you heard about an intelligence agency that was both competent and democratically accountable? I'm asking for a friend. Okay, I'm asking for America. Now I know what some of you might be thinking. This sounds great in theory, but how do we know it actually worked? And that's a fair question. Political systems that look good on paper often fall apart when they meet reality. But here's the thing. We have over 1,000 years of evidence that it worked. Venice maintained political stability, economic prosperity, and territorial integrity longer than any other European state. According to economic historian Carlo Cipolla, Venice maintained the highest per capita income in Europe for over 6 centuries, and they did it through a democratic system that kept power distributed rather than concentrated. Compare that to medieval monarchies, where the death of a single king could throw entire kingdoms into chaos, or to other medieval republics, like Pisa or Genoa, which were constantly torn apart by civil wars and family feuds. Venice figured out something that political scientists are still trying to understand: how to create a system that was stable enough to provide continuity, but flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances. And they did it by treating government like a science rather than an art. According to Venetian political theorist Paolo Sarpi, writing in the early 17th century, the Venetian constitution was designed on the principle that power corrupts, but powerlessness is also dangerous. So they created a system where everyone had some power, but no one had too much power. It's like they invented the concept of political engineering. But here's what I find most remarkable about the Venetian system. It wasn't just effective, it was educational. Serving in Venetian government was considered the highest form of civic duty, and the complex system meant that citizens had to actually understand how government worked in order to participate effectively. According to records from the Marciana Library in Venice, the typical Venetian patrician would serve in dozens of different government positions over the course of his lifetime. Everything from managing trade regulations to conducting diplomatic missions to overseeing public works projects. By the time someone reached senior positions, they had a deep, practical understanding of how every aspect of government functioned. Imagine if every American politician had to serve as a city councillor, a state legislator, a judge, a diplomat, and a business regulator before they could run for Congress or the presidency. How different do you think our politics would be? I'm curious. What do you think about this idea? Do you think American politics would be better if our politicians had to prove their competence in smaller roles before taking on bigger responsibilities? Drop a comment and let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we could improve our own democratic system. Because that's really what the Venetian story's about, the possibility of better government. The Venetians prove that democracy doesn't have to be chaotic, that republics don't have to be unstable, and that you can have both effective leadership and distributed power at the same time. They showed that with careful design, thoughtful institutions, and genuine commitment to the common good, a group of people can govern themselves successfully for centuries. And the best part, they did it all while building one of the most prosperous economies in human history. Which brings us to the next chapter of our story, because the Venetians didn't just master politics, they revolutionized commerce in ways that would make Amazon and Apple executives take notes. We're about to discover how these master politicians became the ultimate entrepreneurs, how they turned the Mediterranean Sea into their personal highway, and how they created the world's first global economy centuries before anyone else even knew what that meant. It's a story of innovation, risk-taking, and business strategies so advanced that modern corporations are still learning from them. Imagine if Amazon, Google, and the Federal Reserve were all run by the same company, and that company controlled 90% of all international trade. Imagine if this mega corporation had been operating successfully for over 800 years, had never faced a serious competitor, and had accumulated so much wealth that it could literally buy and sell entire kingdoms. Now stop imagining, because that company actually existed. It was called Venice, and the story of how a collection of muddy islands became the world's first global commercial empire is so incredible, so ahead of its time, that modern business schools still teach case studies about Venetian trading strategies. But here's what really makes this story mind-blowing. They didn't just stumble into success. The Venetians methodically, scientifically, and ruthlessly engineered the greatest economic monopoly in human history, and they did it using business principles that wouldn't be officially discovered until the 20th century. Are you ready to learn how medieval merchants invented modern capitalism? Because this is going to change how you think about both history and business forever. Once upon a time, in the early centuries after fleeing to the lagoon, Venice was just another small fishing and salt-producing community. The Venetians made their living from the sea, catching fish, harvesting salt from tidal pools, and occasionally ferrying goods between the mainland and the Byzantine territories across the Adriatic. Every day, Venetian merchants would make small trading runs to nearby cities like Ravenna, Pavia, or across to Dalmatia. Nothing spectacular, nothing that would make anyone particularly wealthy. Just the basic commerce that kept small communities alive, according to the economic records preserved in the Venetian state archives, analysed by historian Roberto Cessi in his comprehensive work Storia della Repubblica di Venezia. The typical Venetian trading venture in the 8th century involved maybe a dozen merchants, a single ship, and goods worth perhaps a few hundred gold pieces, enough to support families, but nothing that would build empires. But then came 1095, the year Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade, and suddenly, everything changed. The Crusades created something that had never existed before in European history: massive, organised, long-distance military expeditions that needed supplies, transportation, and financing on an unprecedented scale. Thousands of knights needed ships to carry them to the Holy Land. Tens of thousands of soldiers needed food, weapons, and equipment. And all of this had to be coordinated across thousands of miles and multiple years. Most European powers looked at this logistical nightmare and saw, well, a logistical nightmare. The Venetians looked at it and saw the greatest business opportunity in human history. According to the Chronicle of Dandolo, the Venetians didn't just offer to help with the Crusades. They essentially became the Crusades' logistics department. They provided ships, supplies, financing, and even military support. But here's the brilliant part. They negotiated payment not just in gold, but in trading rights, territorial concessions, and exclusive commercial privileges. In other words, the Venetians turned a religious war into a business expansion strategy, and it worked spectacularly. By the end of the Fourth Crusade in 1204, according to economic historian Frederick Lane's calculations in Venice and History, the Venetians had gained exclusive trading rights in Constantinople, Alexandria, Acre, and dozens of other crucial commercial centres throughout the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions. But getting access to markets was just the beginning. The real genius of Venetian commerce was what they did once they got there. See, most medieval merchants were basically peddlers with boats. They would buy goods in one place, transport them to another place, and sell them for whatever price they could get. It was inefficient, unpredictable, and often unprofitable. The Venetians invented something completely different: systematic market analysis. According to the detailed trading manuals preserved in the Marciana Library, analysed by historian Gino Luzzatto in An Economic History of Italy, Venetian merchants maintained incredibly detailed records of prices, demand patterns, seasonal variations, and political conditions in every market they operated in. They knew that pepper was cheapest in Alexandria during autumn harvest season. They knew that silk prices in Constantinople fluctuated based on caravan arrivals from China. They knew that demand for European wool in Cairo peaked just before the annual flooding of the Nile. In other words, they invented data-driven commerce 800 years before anyone heard of big data analytics. But the most brilliant part of their system was vertical integration. The Venetians didn't just buy and sell goods. They controlled every step of the supply chain from production to final sale. Take spices, for example. According to research by economic historian Niels Steensgaard in the Asian Trade Revolution, by 1300 Venice controlled approximately 80% of the European spice trade. But they didn't just control it, they had systematized it. Venetian agents were permanently stationed in spice-producing regions from India to the Moluccas. These weren't just buyers. They were essentially supply chain managers who coordinated production, transportation, financing, and quality control across thousands of miles and multiple cultures. Meanwhile, back in Venice, other specialists managed European distribution, handled currency exchange, provided financing for other merchants, and even manipulated supply to maintain optimal pricing. It's like they invented Amazon's logistics network 600 years before Jeff Bezos was born, and the profits were absolutely staggering. According to calculations by historian Carlo Cipolla, a successful Venetian spice voyage could generate returns of 200% to 300%, and these weren't rare windfalls, these were regular, predictable business results. To put that in perspective, if you invested $1,000 in a typical Venetian trading venture, you could expect to get back $2,000 to $3,000 within a year. When was the last time your investment portfolio delivered 300% annual returns? But spices were just the beginning. The Venetians applied the same systematic approach to silk, cotton, precious metals, manufactured goods, and even exotic luxury items like pearls, perfumes, and rare manuscripts. They created what economists now recognize as the world's first truly global supply chains. According to trade route maps reconstructed by historian Janet Abou-Lugod in Before European Hegemony, Venetian commercial networks by 1400 stretched from London and Bruges in the west to Crimea and Trebizond in the east, from Alexandria and Damascus in the south to Novgorod and Kiev in the north. That's a larger commercial territory than most modern multinational corporations operate in today. Now, all of this required something that didn't really exist in medieval Europe: sophisticated financial systems. So the Venetians invented those too. They created the world's first standardized international currency exchange system. According to banking historian Raymond Deruva, in his definitive study, Money, Banking and Credit in Medieval Bruges, Venetian banks were operating foreign exchange services in over 50 cities by 1300, using standardized rates and procedures that made international commerce vastly more efficient than it had ever been before. They invented double-entry bookkeeping, which revolutionized how businesses tracked profits and losses. They pioneered maritime insurance, which made long-distance trade much less risky. They even created an early form of joint stock companies, allowing multiple investors to pool resources for large trading ventures. Basically, they invented most of the financial tools that modern capitalism depends on. But here's what I find most impressive about all of this. They didn't just create a business, they created a business culture. Every major Venetian family was involved in international commerce. Children grew up learning not just Latin and Greek, but also Arabic, Turkish, and various Slavic languages necessary for trade. Young men were expected to spend years abroad, learning markets and building relationships. It was like they created a society-wide MBA program centuries before business schools existed. And the crown jewel of this commercial culture? Marco Polo. Now, I know most people think of Marco Polo as an explorer or an adventurer, but that's not quite right. Marco Polo was actually the world's first international business development executive. According to his own account, the description of the world, Marco didn't just wander around Asia sightseeing. He was on a systematic business intelligence mission, identifying new markets, evaluating production capabilities, analyzing political conditions, and establishing relationships that could facilitate future Venetian trade. His famous journey to China wasn't tourism, it was market research. And the information he brought back helped Venice establish commercial relationships that would last for centuries. Think about it. Marco Polo was like a medieval combination of a venture capitalist, a foreign correspondent, and a cultural anthropologist. He was gathering the kind of strategic business intelligence that modern corporations spend billions trying to obtain. And the results speak for themselves. According to economic data compiled by historian Michael McCormick in Origins of the European Economy, Venice by 1400 had achieved a per capita income level that wouldn't be matched by any other European city until the Industrial Revolution. They had turned commerce from a hit-or-miss activity into a science. They had proven that with good information, smart planning, and systematic execution, it was possible to create wealth on a scale that had never been imagined before. I'm curious, as someone living in the age of Amazon and Google, do you see any parallels between what the Venetians were doing and what modern tech companies do? The data analysis, the supply chain optimization, the global reach, the systematic approach to dominating markets. Drop a comment and let me know what connections you see. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Because when you really think about it, the Venetians were the original disruptive technology company. They looked at how international commerce had always been done, figured out how to do it better, and then scaled their improvements until they dominated the entire market. But all of this commercial success created a new challenge. How do you actually produce enough goods to meet the demand you've created? How do you build ships fast enough, manufacture products efficiently enough, and organize complex operations systematically enough to support a global empire? That question led the Venetians to their next great innovation, and it's one that will completely change how you think about manufacturing, innovation, and industrial organization. Because what they built in their famous arsenal wasn't just a shipyard, it was the world's first modern industrial complex, a place so advanced, so efficient, and so revolutionary that it would serve as the template for every major manufacturing breakthrough for the next 6 centuries. There's a moment in 1574 when King Henry III of France visited Venice, and what he witnessed there was so shocking, so impossibly advanced, that he wrote in his diary, "It was like seeing the future with my own eyes." The Venetians had just demonstrated something that shouldn't have been possible in the 16th century. They built an entire warship, completely outfitted and ready for battle, in exactly 1 day. 1 day. To put that in perspective, it took the British Navy 3 years to build a single ship of similar size. The Spanish, who were supposedly the greatest naval power of the era, needed 18 months minimum. But the Venetians, 24 hours, and they were launching a fully armed galley into the lagoon. How is that even remotely possible? The answer lies in understanding that Venice had secretly created something that wouldn't officially exist anywhere else for another 300 years, the world's first modern industrial complex. And the story of how they built it will completely change how you think about innovation, manufacturing, and technological progress. Welcome to the Venetian Arsenal, the place where the medieval world accidentally invented the future. Before we dive into the incredible story of what the arsenal became, let me paint you a picture of what shipbuilding looked like everywhere else in medieval Europe, because the contrast is absolutely mind-blowing. In most places, building a ship was basically an artisan craft project. You'd hire a master shipwright, essentially a skilled craftsman who had learned his trade through years of apprenticeship. He would design the ship in his head, maybe sketch out some rough drawings, and then supervise a small team of carpenters, rope makers, and other specialists who would build the vessel essentially from scratch. According to maritime historian Robert Davis, in his comprehensive study Shipbuilders of the Venetian Arsenal, the typical European shipyard in 1400 could build maybe 2 or 3 ships per year, each one slightly different because every master craftsman had his own methods and preferences. It was slow, expensive, and completely dependent on the knowledge and availability of individual experts. If your master shipwright got sick, died, or moved to another city, your entire shipbuilding program could collapse. But in Venice, something completely different was happening. And it all started with a problem that should sound very familiar to anyone who's ever worked in manufacturing. How do you scale up production when demand far exceeds your capacity? By the early 13th century, Venice's commercial success had created a military necessity. They needed ships, lots of ships, not just for trade, but for protection. Pirates, rival cities and foreign powers were all targeting Venetian merchants, and the only solution was a navy large enough to patrol the entire Mediterranean. According to records preserved in the Venetian state archives, analysed by historian Ennio Consina in the Venetian arsenal, Venice needed to increase their ship production by over 500% just to keep up with demand. Using traditional methods, this would have been impossible, so the Venetians did something that wouldn't be seen anywhere else for centuries. They industrialised. The arsenal that they built starting in 1104 wasn't just a bigger shipyard, it was a completely reimagined approach to manufacturing. According to Frederick Lane's definitive study, Venetian ships and shipbuilders of the Renaissance, the arsenal by 1500 covered over 60 acres, employed more than 16,000 workers, and contained what was essentially the world's first assembly line. Let me describe how this worked, because it's going to sound eerily familiar to anyone who's ever seen a modern factory. First, the Venetians standardized everything. Instead of having each ship be a unique creation, they developed standard designs, standard measurements, and standard components. They created what we would now call modular construction. Hulls, masts, rigging, and armaments were all built to standardized specifications so they could be mixed and matched as needed. According to technical drawings preserved in the Marciana Library, by 1450 the Venetians had standardized designs for over 20 different types of vessels, from small patrol boats to massive merchant galleys, each with precisely specified dimensions, materials requirements, and construction procedures. But here's where it gets really revolutionary. They organize production around workflow rather than individual craftsmen. Instead of having one master shipwright supervise the entire construction of a single ship, the arsenal was organized into specialized departments. One section handled hull construction, another specialized in rigging and sails, a third focused on armaments and artillery, a fourth handled finishing work and outfitting. Ships would move from department to department, with each section adding their specialized components. It's exactly the same principle that Henry Ford would use for automobile production 300 years later, except the Venetians applied it to ships in the 13th century. The results were absolutely staggering. According to production records analysed by economic historian Carlo Cipolla, the arsenal by 1450 could complete a new galley every 2 days during peak production periods. That's faster than most modern shipyards can build similar-sized vessels today, but speed wasn't even the most impressive part. The real breakthrough was quality control and innovation. Because the arsenal centralised all ship production, they could afford to employ full-time researchers and developers, what we would now call an R&D department. According to technical manuscripts preserved in the Venetian archives, the arsenal employed specialists whose only job was to test new materials, experiment with new designs, and develop improved construction techniques. They invented new types of wood treatment that made ships last longer in salt water. They developed new rigging systems that made ships faster and more maneuverable. They created new artillery mounting systems that gave Venetian ships superior firepower. Basically, they turned shipbuilding from a traditional craft into an applied science. It's like they created the medieval equivalent of Apple's design labs, or Google's research division. And just like modern tech companies, they were obsessively secretive about their innovations. According to laws preserved in the Venetian legal codes, revealing arsenal construction techniques to foreigners was punishable by death. Workers had to swear oaths of secrecy. Foreign visitors were strictly forbidden from entering most areas of the facility. The Venetians understood something that modern corporations spend billions trying to achieve: sustainable competitive advantage through technological superiority and trade secret protection. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the arsenal was how they organised their workforce. This wasn't just about having more workers, it was about having smarter workers. According to labour records studied by historian Robert Davis, the arsenal operated what was essentially the world's first corporate training system. New workers went through standardised apprenticeships. Experienced workers could advance through clearly defined skill levels with corresponding pay increases. Master craftsmen were incentivized to share knowledge rather than hoard it. The arsenal even provided what we would now call employee benefits: housing, healthcare, retirement pensions, and disability support. According to social historian Dennis Romano, in Housecraft and Statecraft, arsenal workers had higher living standards and better job security than most nobles in other European cities. Why did Venice invest so much in their workers? Because they understood that in a knowledge-based industry, which shipbuilding had become, your competitive advantage depends entirely on the skills and loyalty of your workforce. It's the same reason that modern tech companies offer elaborate perks, stock options, and career development programs. The Venetians figured this out 600 years ago, and the payoff was incredible. By 1500, according to military historians like John Gilmartin in Gunpowder and Galleys, Venetian ships were so superior to everyone else's that a single Venetian galley could defeat 3 or 4 ships from any other navy. They had better designs, better materials, better construction, and better trained crews. It was like they were fighting with 21st century technology, while everyone else was stuck in the Middle Ages. But here's what I find most fascinating about the arsenal. It wasn't just about military ships. The same principles of standardization, specialization, and continuous innovation that made them dominant in naval warfare also revolutionized civilian shipbuilding. Venetian merchant ships were faster, more reliable, and more cost-effective than anyone else's. This gave Venetian merchants a huge competitive advantage in international trade. Their goods could reach markets faster and more cheaply than competitors. In other words, manufacturing excellence directly supported commercial success. It's exactly the same virtuous cycle that you see with companies like Tesla or Apple today. Superior technology enables superior products, which generate superior profits, which fund even better technology. I'm curious, does this remind you of any modern companies? The secrecy, the innovation culture, the employee benefits, the focus on both speed and quality? Are there any tech companies or manufacturers today that seem to be following the Venetian arsenal playbook? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Because when you really think about it, the arsenal proves something important about innovation. It's not just about having good ideas. It's about creating systems that can turn good ideas into reality at scale. The Venetians didn't just invent better ships. They invented better ways of building ships. They didn't just hire better workers. They created better ways of training and organizing workers. They didn't just build a shipyard. They built an innovation ecosystem. And that ecosystem gave them something that money alone can't buy: the ability to project power anywhere in the known world. Because all of those ships rolling off the arsenal's assembly lines weren't just for show. They were the foundation of what would become the most feared and respected navy in medieval Europe. But naval power isn't just about having lots of ships. It's about having the right strategy, the right tactics, and the right people to use those ships effectively. And that brings us to the next chapter of our story. Because the Venetians didn't just build the medieval world's most advanced fleet. They used it to terrorize 3 continents and reshape the balance of power across the entire known world. Here's a question that should keep naval historians awake at night. How does a city with a population smaller than modern-day Akron, Ohio, build and maintain a navy so powerful that it could single-handedly challenge the Ottoman Empire, the largest, wealthiest, most militarily advanced superpower of the 16th century. And here's an even more mind-bending question. How does that same tiny city-state maintain naval supremacy over the entire Mediterranean Sea for over 3 centuries, defeating Spanish armadas, Ottoman fleets, North African corsairs, and every other maritime power that dared to challenge them? The answer lies in understanding that Venice didn't just build a navy, they revolutionized naval warfare itself. They turned their ships into floating fortresses, their sailors into elite warriors, and their commanders into strategic geniuses whose tactics are still studied in military academies today. This is the story of how Venice became the medieval world's ultimate naval superpower, and why their enemies called them something that still sends chills down historians' spines: the sea wolves of the Adriatic. Let me set the stage by telling you about a moment that perfectly captures just how feared Venetian naval power had become. It's October 7th, 1571, and the largest naval battle in human history is about to begin off the coast of Lepanto in what's now Greece. On one side, you have the Ottoman Empire at the absolute peak of its power. Sultan Selim II has assembled what contemporary sources describe as the most formidable fleet ever seen. Over 300 ships, 34,000 sailors and marines, commanded by Ali Pasha, one of the most experienced naval commanders in the world. This wasn't just any fleet. According to Ottoman naval records preserved in the Topkapi Palace archives, this armada included ships from across 3 continents: Turkish galleys from the Black Sea, Barbary corsair vessels from North Africa, and Egyptian warships from the Red Sea. It was, quite literally, the combined naval might of the Islamic world. Facing them was a Christian alliance fleet that, on paper, should have been completely outmatched. The Holy League, as it was called, had fewer ships, fewer men, and less experience fighting as a unified force. But here's the thing that Ottoman intelligence apparently didn't fully understand. At the heart of this Christian fleet was a corps of Venetian galleys and Venetian commanders who'd been perfecting the art of naval warfare for over 4 centuries. According to the detailed account by historian John Gilmartin in Gunpowder and Galleys, the Venetians brought something to Lepanto that no one else possessed: a completely integrated system of naval technology, tactics, and training that had been continuously refined through generations of Mediterranean warfare. And the results? In less than 4 hours, the supposedly invincible Ottoman fleet was completely destroyed. Over 200 Ottoman ships were sunk or captured. Nearly 30,000 Ottoman sailors and soldiers were killed or wounded. The Ottoman naval threat to European civilization was eliminated in a single afternoon. But here's what makes this victory even more remarkable. This wasn't a fluke. This was the culmination of centuries of Venetian naval innovation and strategic thinking. Let me take you back to understand how Venice developed this incredible naval capability, because the story reads like a masterclass in military evolution. It all started with geography. Venice's location in the northern Adriatic meant that Venetian merchants were constantly under threat from pirates, rival city-states, and foreign navies. But instead of just building bigger ships or hiring more sailors, the Venetians approached naval defence like they approached everything else, scientifically and systematically. According to maritime historian Fernand Braudel, in his monumental work The Mediterranean and the Mediterranean World, Venice by 1300 had developed what we would now recognise as the world's first professional navy. Not mercenaries, not feudal levies, but full-time, professionally trained naval personnel with standardised equipment, tactics and procedures. This might not sound revolutionary to us, but in the medieval world it was absolutely unprecedented. Most navies were assembled only when needed, using whatever ships and sailors were available at the moment. Venice maintained a permanent fleet, with permanent crews and permanent training programs. The results were immediately apparent. Venetian ships didn't just defend Venetian merchants. They dominated the seas wherever they appeared. Take the galley, for example. Now, galleys weren't unique to Venice. They had been the standard Mediterranean warship for centuries, but the Venetians took this ancient design and turned it into something completely new. According to technical studies by naval archaeologist Mauro Bondioli, published in The Art of the Galley, Venetian galleys by 1400 incorporated innovations that made them faster, more maneuverable, and more heavily armed than anyone else's ships. They developed new hull designs that reduced drag and increased speed. They created new rigging systems that allowed for quicker sail changes and better performance in different wind conditions. They invented new artillery arrangements that gave their ships superior firepower while maintaining maneuverability. But most importantly, they solved the fundamental tactical problem of galley warfare: how to coordinate multiple ships in complex battle formations. Medieval naval battles were usually chaotic affairs where individual ships fought individual duels. The Venetians developed what military historians call line tactics, the ability to maneuver entire fleets as single units, concentrating firepower where it was most needed while maintaining defensive formations. It's exactly the same principle that made the Roman legions so effective, except applied to naval warfare. And just like the Roman legions, once you understood how it worked, it was almost impossible to defeat. According to battle accounts preserved in the Venetian state archives, Venetian fleets regularly defeated enemy forces 2 or 3 times their size simply through superior tactics and coordination. But tactics alone don't explain Venice's naval dominance. The real secret was their approach to training and leadership development. Remember how I mentioned that Venice created a professional navy? Well, they also created what was essentially the world's first naval academy. According to records studied by historian Alberto Tenenti in Piracy and the Decline of Venice, Venice by 1500 had established formal training programs for naval officers, standardized promotion procedures, and systematic methods for developing naval expertise. Young Venetian nobles didn't just inherit naval commands, they had to earn them through demonstrated competence at sea. They started as junior officers, learned seamanship and navigation, studied battle tactics, and proved themselves in actual combat before being given major responsibilities. Compare this to most other navies, where commands were typically given based on social rank, political connections, or whoever happened to be available. The Venetians created a true meritocracy at sea, and it showed. According to military analyst William McNeill, in Venice, the hinge of Europe, Venetian naval commanders by 1500 had an average of over 15 years of active duty experience before receiving major fleet commands. Most other European naval leaders had maybe 2 or 3 years of actual sea time. The difference in competence was staggering. But perhaps the most impressive thing about Venetian naval power was its strategic flexibility. They didn't just build one type of ship for one type of mission. They created an entire ecosystem of naval capabilities. For long-range commerce protection, they built large merchant galleys that could fight off pirates while carrying valuable cargo. For coastal patrol, they developed smaller, faster vessels that could pursue raiders into shallow waters. For major naval battles, they constructed heavy warships armed with the latest artillery technology. And for special operations, well, this is where the Seawolves' reputation really came from. According to accounts by contemporary historian Paolo Peruta, Venice by 1550 was operating what we would now recognize as an early form of naval special forces. Elite crews in specially modified ships that could conduct raids, reconnaissance missions, and targeted strikes against enemy positions. These weren't just pirates or privateers. They were professional military units with specific objectives, sophisticated equipment, and direct government authorization. Think Navy SEALs, but with 16th century technology. The psychological impact was enormous. Coastal cities throughout the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, and even Spain lived in constant fear of sudden Venetian raids. According to Ottoman administrative records studied by historian Daniel Goffman, entire regions modified their coastal defences specifically to counter the threat of Venetian naval attacks. I'm curious, does this remind you of any modern naval power? The professional training, the technological superiority, the global reach, the ability to project power anywhere in the world. Does the Venetian naval dominance of the Mediterranean remind you at all of, say, American naval dominance today? Let me know what connections you see. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Because that's really what Venice achieved. They became the America of the medieval Mediterranean. Their navy wasn't just powerful, it was so overwhelmingly superior that it shaped the behaviour of every other power in the region. But all of this naval strength had a price. Maintaining professional fleets, developing advanced technology, and conducting continuous operations across 3 continents required enormous resources. And those resources had to come from somewhere. Which brings us back to that incredible victory at Lepanto in 1571. Because while that battle marked the high point of Venetian naval power, it also marked the beginning of the end. The cost of maintaining such naval supremacy was becoming unsustainable, even for Venice. But before we get to that story, we need to understand something else about Venice's golden age. How all of this wealth, power, and international influence translated into one of the most spectacular cultural achievements in human history. Because while Venice was building the world's most advanced navy, they were also creating some of the most beautiful art and architecture ever conceived. And that art wasn't just decoration, it was a deliberate strategy for projecting power, attracting allies, and demonstrating to the world that Venice wasn't just militarily and economically dominant, but culturally superior as well. The story of how Venice became the Renaissance world's ultimate cultural magnet is a tale of artistic genius, stolen treasures, and architectural innovations that still take your breath away today. Sometimes the greatest crimes in history are committed by the most respectable people, and sometimes the most beautiful art comes from the most questionable circumstances, which brings me to a story that sounds like something straight out of Ocean's 11, except it happened 800 years ago, involved an entire crusade, and the target wasn't a casino vault. It was the richest, most cultured city in the world. The crime? Venice orchestrated what might be the most audacious art heist in human history. They convinced a holy war to change course. They manipulated an entire crusade for profit, and in the process they liberated approximately 500 tons of gold, silver, precious gems and priceless artifacts from Constantinople, the crown jewel of the Byzantine Empire. And here's the really incredible part. Not only did they get away with it completely, but they used their stolen treasures to transform Venice into the most beautiful city on earth. Every time you see a photo of St. Mark's Basilica, every time someone gushes about Venetian architecture, you're actually looking at the proceeds of the medieval world's greatest heist. This is the story of how Venice stole an entire civilization, and why we still celebrate them for it today. To understand how Venice pulled off this incredible scheme, we need to go back to the year 1201, when Pope Innocent III called for what would become known as the Fourth Crusade. The plan was simple. Christian knights would sail to the Holy Land, recapture Jerusalem from Muslim forces, and restore Christian control over the holy sites. But here's where the story gets interesting, because according to the detailed chronicle written by Geoffrey de Villehardouin, who was actually there, the crusade ran into a problem almost immediately: transportation. Medieval armies were massive, complicated logistical operations. The Fourth Crusade included thousands of knights, tens of thousands of foot soldiers, hundreds of horses, and enormous quantities of weapons, food, and equipment. Getting all of this from Western Europe to the Holy Land required a fleet of ships that simply didn't exist, except in one place, Venice. So the Crusade leaders travelled to Venice to negotiate with Doge Enrico Dandolo, and this is where we meet one of the most brilliant, ruthless, and successful con artists in medieval history. Dandolo was in his 80s, supposedly blind, and had been leading Venice for over a decade. According to contemporary accounts by the Byzantine historian Nikitas Choniates, Dandolo was also one of the shrewdest negotiators who ever lived. The Crusaders needed ships. Venice had ships. It should have been a straightforward business transaction. But Dandolo saw something much bigger, an opportunity to settle some very old scores. You see, Venice and Constantinople had a complicated relationship. Constantinople was the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the successor to ancient Rome, and still one of the wealthiest, most powerful cities in the world. For centuries, Venetian merchants had done business there, but always as junior partners, always paying tribute, always being reminded that they were just upstart merchants from a swamp. According to the analysis by historian Thomas Madden in Enrico Dandolo and the Rise of Venice, Dandolo had personally experienced Byzantine arrogance decades earlier, during a diplomatic mission that had ended with him being humiliated and possibly even blinded by Byzantine officials. So when the Crusaders came asking for help, Dandolo didn't just see a transportation contract, he saw revenge. The deal he negotiated was brilliant in its deviousness. Venice would provide ships for the entire crusade, but the payment was more than the Crusaders could afford up front. No problem, Dandolo suggested. They could pay the balance later, after they conquered Jerusalem and captured all that Muslim gold. But in the meantime, as a small favour, perhaps the Crusaders could help Venice with a tiny problem. The city of Zara, on the Adriatic coast, had been causing some trade difficulties. Maybe the crusade could make a quick stop there on the way to the Holy Land. According to Villehardouin's account, many crusaders were uncomfortable with this arrangement. Zara was a Christian city, and attacking Christians wasn't exactly the point of a crusade. But they needed those ships, and Dandolo was very persuasive. So the Fourth Crusade conquered Zara, and suddenly the Crusaders owed Venice even more money, because military campaigns are expensive, and the plunder from Zara wasn't nearly enough to cover their debts. No problem, Dandolo suggested again. There was another small favour Venice needed. The rightful Emperor of Byzantium, a young man named Alexios IV, had been overthrown by a usurper. Perhaps the crusade could make another small detour, restore the legitimate emperor to power, and in return this grateful emperor would certainly pay enough to cover all the Crusaders' debts to Venice. Can you see what's happening here? Step by step, favour by favour, Dandolo was steering an entire crusade away from its original mission and toward his real target, Constantinople itself. According to the detailed account by historian Jonathan Harris in Constantinople, capital of Byzantium, what happened next was one of the most systematic and thorough city sackings in medieval history. On April 13, 1204, the combined Venetian and Crusader forces broke through Constantinople's defences and poured into the city. For 3 days they looted everything that wasn't nailed down, and quite a lot of things that were. But here's what makes this different from typical medieval warfare. This wasn't random destruction. According to contemporary Byzantine accounts, the Venetians came prepared with lists. They knew exactly which churches contained the most valuable religious artifacts, which palaces housed the finest art collections, which libraries contained the rarest manuscripts. This wasn't just pillaging, it was systematic cultural asset stripping. The numbers are staggering. According to economic calculations by historian Michael McCormick, the treasure looted from Constantinople in 1204 was worth approximately $200 billion in today's money. Gold, silver, precious gems, silk, spices, religious relics, classical sculptures, illuminated manuscripts, imperial regalia, essentially the accumulated cultural wealth of a 1,000-year-old empire, and Venice got the lion's share. But here's what I find most remarkable about this story. The Venetians didn't just steal all this treasure, they used it brilliantly. Most of the plunder went directly into transforming Venice itself. According to architectural studies by historian Otto Demas in The Church of San Marco in Venice, the St. Mark's Basilica that tourists visit today was largely rebuilt and decorated using materials and artifacts looted from Constantinople. Those incredible bronze horses on the facade, stolen from Constantinople's hippodrome, the porphyry columns, taken from Byzantine churches, the golden altarpiece, made from melted-down Byzantine religious objects, the mosaics, created by Byzantine artists who were essentially kidnapped and forced to work in Venice. Even the body of St. Mark himself, Venice's patron saint, had been liberated from Alexandria in an earlier equally audacious theft operation. So when you look at St. Mark's Basilica today, you're not just seeing Venetian architecture, you're seeing a monument built from the stolen cultural heritage of multiple civilizations. And the really incredible part, it worked perfectly. The treasures and artistic techniques that Venice acquired from Constantinople transformed the city from a prosperous but relatively provincial trading centre into one of the great cultural capitals of the world. According to art historian Patricia Fortini Brown, in Venice and Antiquity, the Byzantine influence acquired through the 1204 conquest fundamentally changed Venetian artistic style, architectural design, and cultural identity. Venice essentially absorbed the sophistication and artistic traditions of the older, more established Byzantine civilization. It's like if Las Vegas had somehow managed to steal all the cultural treasures of Paris, London, and Rome and then used them to transform itself into the world's most beautiful city. Audacious, questionable ethically, but undeniably effective. But Venice didn't stop with just accumulating stolen art. They used their newfound cultural prestige to attract the best artists, architects, and intellectuals of the age. According to Patronage records studied by historian Peter Humphrey in Painting in Renaissance Venice, Venice by 1400 had become one of Europe's most important artistic centres, commissioning works from masters like Giovanni Bellini, Giorgione, and eventually Titian and Tintoretto. The Venetians understood something that modern cities are still trying to figure out. Cultural achievement is a form of soft power. Beautiful art, magnificent architecture, and intellectual sophistication attract talent, investment, and international prestige in ways that military force alone never can. Compare Venice's approach to that of Florence, which we typically think of as the heart of Renaissance culture. Florence certainly produced incredible artists and patrons, but their cultural achievements came primarily through internal development and local talent. Venice, on the other hand, essentially acquired a millennium of Byzantine cultural sophistication overnight, then used that foundation to become a magnet for artistic talent from across Europe. According to cultural historian Margaret Plant in Venice Fragile City, Venice by 1500 was home to artists, writers, musicians, and intellectuals from dozens of different countries and cultural backgrounds. It was like they had created the medieval equivalent of New York City, a place where people came from everywhere to be part of something bigger and more exciting than what they could find at home. I'm curious, what do you think about this approach to cultural development? Is it acceptable for cities or countries to acquire cultural treasures through conquest or theft, if they then used them to create something even more magnificent? Should we judge historical art acquisition by the standards of their time or our time? Let me know what you think in the comments. These questions about cultural heritage and artistic ownership are still very relevant today, because that's really what the story of St. Mark's reveals. The complex relationship between power, wealth, art, and cultural achievement. Venice used military and economic strength to acquire artistic treasures, then used those treasures to attract more artists and create even greater cultural achievements. But all of this raises fascinating questions about what Venice was actually like for the people who lived there. We've talked about the politics, the commerce, the military power, and the cultural achievements. But what was it actually like to wake up every morning in this floating empire? How did ordinary Venetians live, work, and play in a city built on water, wealth, and stolen treasures? The answers might surprise you, because Venice wasn't just a successful civilization. It was also one of the most socially progressive, culturally diverse, and personally liberated societies in medieval Europe. And the stories of daily life in the Golden Republic reveal aspects of Venetian society that were centuries ahead of their time. There's a moment in 1581 when a French diplomat named Michel de Montaigne visits Venice and writes something in his journal that completely contradicts everything we think we know about medieval society. He's describing a dinner party he attended, and he mentions, almost casually, that the most intelligent conversation of the evening came from the women, not the men. He notes that these women owned property, ran businesses, influenced politics, and spoke multiple languages. This wasn't unusual in Venice. This was normal. What Montaigne had stumbled into was a society so progressive, so ahead of its time, that it wouldn't be matched anywhere else in Europe for another 3 centuries. While women in England couldn't own property, while women in France couldn't speak in church, while women across medieval Europe were essentially legal property of their fathers and husbands, Venetian women were running international businesses, influencing government policy, and living lives of independence that would make 21st century feminists proud. But that's just the beginning of what made Venetian society extraordinary. Because when you really dig into what daily life was like in the Golden Republic, you discover a civilization that was not only incredibly wealthy and powerful, but also surprisingly modern, startlingly diverse, and almost shockingly liberated. Welcome to a day in the life of medieval Venice, the most progressive society the world wouldn't see again for centuries. Let me take you through a typical day in 15th century Venice by following someone whose story perfectly captures what made this society so unique. Caterina Corner, who wasn't just any Venetian woman. She was a businesswoman, a political player, and eventually the Queen of Cyprus. Her daily routine, preserved in detailed records studied by historian Stanley Choynacki in Women and Men in Renaissance Venice, gives us an incredible window into how differently Venice operated from the rest of medieval Europe. Caterina's day would begin around dawn, not with prayers or domestic duties like most medieval women, but with business correspondence. According to commercial records preserved in the Venetian State Archives, Caterina, by age 25, was personally managing trading operations that extended from London to Constantinople, overseeing investments worth hundreds of thousands of ducats, roughly equivalent to tens of millions of dollars today. She could do this because Venetian law, unlike anywhere else in Europe, allowed women to inherit property, conduct business, and even represent themselves in court. According to legal historian Julius Kirschner's analysis in Marriage, Family and Law in Medieval Europe, Venetian women had legal rights that wouldn't appear in England until the 19th century, and wouldn't reach some parts of Europe until the 20th century. But Caterina's morning business wasn't conducted from some secluded domestic space. She worked from her palazzo's ground floor, the same space where male merchants conducted their affairs, meeting directly with ship captains, foreign traders, and government officials. Around mid-morning, she might walk through the city to check on various business interests, and this walk reveals something else extraordinary about Venetian society: the sheer diversity of people you'd encounter on any street corner. According to demographic studies by historian Benjamin Ravid in Economics and Toleration in 17th century Venice, Venice by 1500 was home to one of the most ethnically and religiously diverse populations in medieval Europe. On any given day in the Rialto market, you might hear conversations in Italian, Greek, Arabic, Turkish, German, Slavic languages, and several dialects of Hebrew. This wasn't just tolerance, it was strategic inclusiveness. The Venetians understood that diversity was profitable. Foreign merchants brought valuable trade connections, skilled craftsmen brought technological innovations, and intellectual refugees brought new ideas and perspectives. They had essentially figured out what modern economists call diversity dividends, the idea that heterogeneous societies outperform homogeneous ones economically and intellectually, about 5 centuries before anyone had the academic framework to explain why it worked. But perhaps the most striking thing about walking through Venice was the social mobility you'd witness. Unlike most medieval societies, where your birth determined your entire life trajectory, Venice operated much more like a meritocracy. Take Giovanni Bellini, for example. According to art historian Peter Humphreys' research in Painting in Renaissance Venice, Bellini came from a middle-class artisan family, but through talent and hard work, he became one of the most famous and wealthy artists in Europe, commissioned by nobles and government officials who treated him as an equal rather than a servant. Or consider the career of Pietro Bembo, studied by historian Laura Martinez in Power and Imagination. Bembo was born into a merchant family, respectable but not aristocratic. Yet through education and ability, he became one of Venice's most influential cultural figures, served in high government positions, and was eventually made a cardinal. This social fluidity was possible because Venice had developed what sociologists now recognize as a weak class system. Social categories existed, but they were permeable rather than rigid. By noon, our day in Venice might include stopping by one of the city's famous coffee houses. And yes, Venice had coffee houses in the 15th century, about 200 years before they appeared in London or Paris. According to social historian Brian Pullen in Rich and Poor in Renaissance Venice, these weren't just places to drink coffee, but crucial social institutions where merchants, intellectuals, artists, and government officials mixed freely, exchanging information and ideas across traditional social boundaries. The afternoon might bring a visit to one of Venice's legendary courtesans, and here we need to talk about something that made Venice unique even within its own extraordinary context. Venetian courtesans weren't what most people imagine when they hear that term. According to the detailed study by historian Margaret Rosenthal in The Honest Courtesan, Venice's most famous courtesans were essentially Renaissance celebrity intellectuals who happened to also provide intimate companionship. Veronica Franco, perhaps the most famous, was a published poet whose work was studied throughout Europe. She spoke multiple languages, engaged in philosophical correspondence with leading thinkers, and hosted salons that influenced Venetian cultural and political life. According to her preserved letters, she counted among her clients and friends some of the most powerful men in Europe, including kings and emperors who sought her out as much for her conversation as for any other services. This tells us something remarkable about Venetian society. They'd created social spaces where intelligence and wit were valued regardless of conventional moral categories. In most of medieval Europe, a woman like Franco would have been socially invisible or actively persecuted. In Venice, she was a celebrated public figure. The evening might include the kind of entertainment that made Venice famous throughout Europe: elaborate gambling establishments that operated openly and legally. According to gaming historian Gerda Reith's research in The Age of Chance, Venice by 1500 had more public gambling houses than any other European city, and they weren't just for the wealthy, they served all social classes and both men and women. But this wasn't just about entertainment. The Venetians had figured out that regulated gambling generated significant tax revenue, while providing a relatively harmless outlet for social tensions. They had essentially invented the concept of vice taxation centuries before modern governments started using similar strategies. As night fell, the city would transform into something that must have seemed magical to foreign visitors. According to contemporary accounts preserved in travel diaries studied by historian Edward Muir in Civic Ritual in Renaissance Venice, Venice by dark was illuminated by more oil lamps and torches than any other medieval city. Why? Because Venice was safe enough for people to move around after dark, something that was almost unimaginable in most medieval urban centres. The combination of effective law enforcement, economic prosperity, and social stability meant that Venetian nightlife was legendary throughout Europe, and if our day happened to fall during carnival season, well, that's when Venice really showed what made it different from everywhere else. According to festival historian James Johnson in Venice Incognito, Venetian Carnival wasn't just a few days of celebration, it lasted for months, during which normal social rules were essentially suspended. People wore masks that concealed their identity, allowing nobles and commoners to interact as equals, men and women to reverse traditional roles, and foreigners to participate fully in Venetian social life. But here's what I find most remarkable about Carnival. It wasn't just tolerated by the government, it was actively promoted as state policy. The Venetian authorities understood that these periods of social release actually strengthened social stability by providing outlets for tensions and grievances. They had essentially invented the concept of pressure valve governance, using controlled periods of license to maintain long-term social order. I'm curious, does this kind of progressive medieval society surprise you? When you think about the Middle Ages, do you imagine the kind of social freedom, economic opportunity and cultural diversity that existed in Venice? What aspects of Venetian society seem most modern to you? Drop a comment and let me know. I'm always fascinated by how different historical reality can be from our assumptions, because that's really what makes the Venetian story so compelling. They proved that medieval didn't have to mean backward, that prosperity didn't require oppression, and that stability didn't require conformity. They created a society that was simultaneously deeply traditional. They revered their customs, honoured their ancestors, and maintained their political institutions for centuries, and radically innovative in how they adapted those traditions to changing circumstances. But all of this social progressiveness, economic opportunity and cultural freedom was built on a foundation that we haven't fully explored yet. The incredible wealth and political influence of the great merchant families who essentially owned Venice. These weren't just rich people. They were dynasties whose power, sophistication and international reach rivaled royal families, except they operated in a republic where they had to compete with each other for influence rather than simply inheriting it. The stories of these merchant princes, their rise to power, their internal politics, and their centuries-long competition for control of the Golden Republic reveal the hidden machinery that made all of Venice's achievements possible. Behind every great democracy lies a simple question: who really holds the power? In America, we like to think it's we the people, but if you dig deeper, you start noticing certain names that appear again and again throughout our history. The Rockefellers, who shaped our oil industry and banking system, the Kennedys, who dominated politics for generations, the Astors, who controlled New York real estate, These families didn't just get rich, they became American dynasties whose influence stretched across centuries. But what if I told you that 1,000 years before America was even discovered, Venice had already perfected this system? What if I told you that behind Venice's seemingly democratic government stood a handful of families so powerful, so wealthy, and so politically sophisticated that they essentially owned the entire republic? And what if I told you that these merchant princes operated with a level of strategic brilliance that would make modern political dynasties look like amateur hour? Meet the real rulers of Venice, the families whose names you've never heard, but whose power shaped the course of world history for over a millennium. To understand how these Venetian dynasties operated, let me tell you the story of one family that perfectly exemplifies both the brilliance and the ruthlessness of Venice's merchant princes, the Dandolo clan. And our story begins with perhaps the most cunning political mastermind in medieval history, the same Enrico Dandolo who orchestrated the conquest of Constantinople. But here's what most history books don't tell you about Dandolo. He wasn't some aging opportunist who stumbled into a lucky break. He was the latest in a centuries-long line of strategic thinkers who'd been methodically building Venetian power since the city's founding. According to genealogical research by historian Andrea da Mosto in the Doge of Venice, the Dandolo family had been major players in Venetian politics since at least 1000 AD, over 200 years before Enrico's famous crusade manipulation. They hadn't just gotten lucky, they had spent generations positioning themselves to take advantage of exactly the kind of opportunity that the Fourth Crusade represented. Think about what this means. While most medieval families were focused on acquiring land or titles, the Dandolos were playing a much longer, more sophisticated game. They were building networks, accumulating information, developing expertise, and positioning family members throughout Venice's government and commercial systems. It's exactly the same strategy that modern political dynasties use, except the Dandolos were doing it in the 11th century. And the results were spectacular. According to calculations by economic historian Frederick Lane in Andrea Barbarigo, Merchant of Venice, the Dandolo family by 1300 controlled commercial operations worth approximately $2 billion in today's money. But money was just the beginning. They had also placed family members in crucial government positions, forged marriage alliances with other powerful families, and established business relationships that extended from England to India. They had essentially created what political scientists now call a patronage network, a system where political power, economic opportunity, and social influence all reinforced each other across multiple generations. But the Dandolos were just one of several families operating at this level. The Morosinis had specialized in maritime trade and naval command, producing more admirals and sea captains than any other Venetian family. According to military historian John Gilmartin, the Morosinis by 1400 effectively controlled Venice's naval strategy, with family members commanding fleets, designing ships, and managing the arsenal's operations. The Mocenigoes had focused on mainland expansion and diplomatic relations, becoming Venice's de facto foreign policy establishment, according to diplomatic historian Donald Queller's research in the Venetian Patriciate. Mocenigo family members served as ambassadors, negotiated treaties, and managed Venice's complex relationships with other European powers for over 3 centuries. The Barbaros had concentrated on banking and finance, essentially becoming Venice's Federal Reserve centuries before central banking was invented anywhere else. According to financial records analysed by economist Raymond de Ruva, the Barbaro banks by 1500 were managing currency exchange, international credit, and government financing across much of Europe. Each family had carved out their own sphere of expertise, but here's the really brilliant part. They cooperated as much as they competed. According to political scientist Robert Finley's analysis in Politics in Renaissance Venice, these great families had developed what he calls collaborative oligarchy, a system where different dynasties controlled different aspects of Venetian power while working together to maintain the overall system that benefited them all. It's like if the Rockefellers controlled oil, the Morgans controlled banking, the Astors controlled real estate, and the Kennedys controlled politics, but instead of fighting each other, they coordinated their efforts to maintain a system that kept them all in power for centuries. And the sophistication of their methods was incredible. Take marriage strategy, for example. According to genealogical studies by Stanley Choynacki in Women and Men in Renaissance Venice, the great Venetian families didn't just arrange marriages for love or even just for money. They used marriages as strategic alliances to create complex webs of mutual obligation and shared interest. A typical great family marriage might connect Venetian commercial interests with Byzantine political connections, link naval expertise with banking capital, or unite mainland territorial holdings with international trading networks. Over time, this created an integrated elite where everyone was related to everyone else, and where family loyalty, business interest, and political advantage were impossible to separate. According to Choynacki's calculations, by 1500 the top 20 Venetian families were connected through over 400 documented marriage alliances spanning 4 centuries. They had essentially created what sociologists now call a closed network, a system where access to power, wealth, and opportunity was controlled by a relatively small group of interconnected families. But here's what made the Venetian system different from typical aristocracy. These families maintained their power not through birthright or royal favour, but through continuous performance. Venice remained a republic, which meant that political positions still had to be won through elections. Commercial success still required outperforming competitors, and social status still depended on contributing to the common good. This created what economist Darren Acemoglu might call competitive elitism, a system where a small group held most of the power, but they had to continually prove they deserved it. According to records preserved in the Venetian state archives, analysed by historian Brian Pullen in Rich and Poor in Renaissance Venice, the great families invested enormous resources in what we would now call human capital development. Children received the finest educations available anywhere in Europe, including not just classical learning but practical training in languages, mathematics, navigation, law, and international relations. Young family members were expected to spend years abroad, learning markets, building relationships, and proving their competence before being given significant responsibilities. It was like a centuries-long MBA program combined with diplomatic training and business apprenticeship, and the standards were high. According to biographical research by historian Margaret King in Venetian Humanism, in an age of patrician dominance, family members who failed to demonstrate competence were quietly sidelined, regardless of their birth order or inheritance rights. The dynasties maintained their power by consistently producing capable leaders, not by protecting incompetent heirs. It's a level of meritocratic discipline that most modern family businesses could learn from. But perhaps the most impressive thing about these Venetian dynasties was their long-term strategic thinking. According to analysis by historian Frederick Lane, the great families thought in terms of centuries, not decades. They made investments, formed alliances, and positioned themselves for opportunities that might not pay off for generations. The conquest of Constantinople in 1204, for example, wasn't just Enrico Dandolo's clever manipulation. It was the culmination of over a century of Dandolo family preparation for exactly that kind of opportunity. They had spent generations learning about Byzantine politics, building relationships in Constantinople, and developing the naval and commercial capabilities that made the conquest profitable. Similarly, when Venice began expanding onto the Italian mainland in the 15th century, the families involved had been preparing for that expansion since the 13th century, acquiring mainland properties, forming alliances with mainland nobles, and developing the military and administrative expertise needed to govern territorial holdings. It's the kind of strategic patience that modern corporations claim to practice but rarely achieve. These families were thinking and planning across lifespans. I'm curious, does this remind you of any modern family dynasties? Do you see parallels between how the Venetian merchant princes operated and how powerful families maintain influence in America or other countries today? What similarities do you notice in terms of strategy, networking, or long-term planning? Drop a comment and let me know your thoughts, because when you really study how these Venetian families operated, you start to understand something important about power. It's not just about having wealth or holding office. Real power comes from creating systems that generate wealth, influence, and opportunity across multiple generations. The Venetian merchant princes didn't just get rich and powerful. They built institutions, networks, and traditions that kept their families relevant for centuries. They understood that in a republic, even an oligarchic one, you maintain power by making yourself indispensable, not by demanding obedience, and they were indispensable. According to economic calculations by historian Carlo Cipolla, the great families by 1500 were directly responsible for over 60% of Venice's international commerce, 70% of its government revenues, and 80% of its naval capabilities. Venice literally could not function without them, which is exactly how they designed the system. But maintaining this level of control required more than just business acumen and political skill. It required something much more sophisticated. A comprehensive intelligence network that could monitor threats, identify opportunities, and influence events across the entire Mediterranean world. And that brings us to one of the most remarkable and least understood aspects of Venetian power, their espionage system. Because while the merchant princes provided the wealth and political leadership that made Venice dominant, it was their spies, informants, and intelligence operatives who provided the information advantage that kept Venice ahead of every competitor for centuries. The story of how Venice created the medieval world's most sophisticated intelligence network is a tale of diplomatic genius, technological innovation, and strategic thinking that makes modern intelligence agencies look almost primitive by comparison. Every great intelligence agency has an origin story, and most of them sound remarkably similar. A moment of national crisis, an innovative leader, and the sudden realization that information is the ultimate weapon. The CIA was born from World War II intelligence operations. MI6 emerged from British colonial intelligence networks. The KGB evolved from Soviet revolutionary organizations. But what if I told you that the most sophisticated intelligence service in history was created not in the 20th century, not during the Cold War, not even during the Renaissance, but in medieval Venice, by merchants who understood something that modern spy agencies are still trying to master, that the best intelligence isn't gathered through dramatic operations or high-tech gadgets, but through patient relationship building and systematic information analysis. Welcome to the story of how Venice created the world's first modern intelligence network, a system so advanced, so comprehensive, and so effective that it gave them a strategic advantage over every other power in the world for over 6 centuries. This isn't just spy history, it's the blueprint that every intelligence agency since has been trying to copy. The story begins in 1268 with a Venetian merchant named Marco Sanudo, and what happened to him reveals something crucial about how Venice approached information gathering. According to diplomatic records preserved in the Vatican secret archives, analysed by historian Donald Queller in the office of ambassador in the Middle Ages, Sanudo was conducting routine business in Constantinople when he witnessed something extraordinary. A meeting between Byzantine officials and representatives of the Mongol Empire. Now, in most medieval societies, a merchant who happened to overhear sensitive political information would either ignore it, gossip about it, or maybe try to sell the information for personal profit. But Sanudo did something completely different. He carefully documented everything he had seen and heard, then sent a detailed encrypted report back to Venice through official channels. Why? Because Venice had already, by 1268, established something that wouldn't appear anywhere else in Europe for another 2 centuries, a systematic intelligence collection network. According to historian Garrett Mattingly's groundbreaking study, Renaissance Diplomacy, Venice by 1300 had stationed permanent representatives in every major European capital and most significant commercial centres throughout the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions. These weren't just temporary envoys sent for specific negotiations. They were full-time intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover. Think about how revolutionary this was. While other European powers were still sending occasional embassies for specific purposes, Venice had created a permanent global network of information gathering. They had essentially invented the concept of diplomatic intelligence 3 centuries before it became standard practice. But here's what made the Venetian system truly remarkable. They didn't just collect information, they analysed it systematically. According to records studied by historian Eric Dursteler in Renegade Women, the Venetian Senate by 1400 had established what we would now recognise as an intelligence analysis department, complete with specialists who did nothing but study political trends, economic patterns, and military developments across Europe and the Mediterranean. These weren't amateur part-time observers. According to personnel records preserved in the Venetian state archives, Venice employed full-time intelligence analysts who spoke multiple languages, understood different cultural contexts, and could synthesize information from dozens of sources to produce strategic assessments for government decision-makers. It's exactly the same structure that modern intelligence agencies use, except the Venetians created it in the medieval period using nothing but human networks and careful analysis. And the sophistication of their operations was incredible. Let me tell you about Lorenzo Priuli, whose career perfectly illustrates how Venetian intelligence worked at its peak. According to biographical research by historian Benjamin Arbel in Trading Nations, Priuli spent 15 years operating as a merchant in Ottoman territories during the late 15th century. But his real job wasn't commerce, it was intelligence collection. Under cover of his trading business, Priuli systematically gathered information about Ottoman military capabilities, political factions, economic conditions, and strategic planning. His reports, preserved in the Venetian diplomatic archives, read like modern intelligence assessments. Detailed analysis of Ottoman naval construction programs, systematic evaluation of different regional governors' loyalty to the Sultan, careful monitoring of economic indicators that might predict political instability. According to Priuli's own accounts, he maintained a network of over 40 sub-agents throughout the Ottoman Empire, merchants, clerks, translators, and even officials who provided regular reports on everything from grain prices to troop movements. But here's the really brilliant part. Priuli's network was just one of dozens that Venice operated simultaneously. According to calculations by intelligence historian Christopher Andrew in The Secret World, Venice by 1500 was running intelligence operations in over 30 different cities across 4 continents, using hundreds of agents and analysts. They had created what modern intelligence experts call multi-source intelligence fusion, the ability to combine information from diverse sources to create comprehensive strategic assessments. And they were doing this with medieval technology and communication systems. The results were spectacular. According to military historian John Gilmartin, Venetian commanders routinely possessed better intelligence about enemy forces than those enemies had about their own capabilities. Venice knew about Ottoman naval construction before the Ottomans had finalized their own plans. They understood French political intentions before the French had made final decisions. This intelligence advantage translated directly into strategic success. According to analysis by diplomatic historian Garrett Mattingly, Venice during its Golden Age won over 70% of its military conflicts, negotiated favourable terms in over 80% of its international agreements, and avoided disasters that destroyed other European powers largely because they always knew more about what was happening than anyone else did. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of Venetian intelligence was how they managed to maintain operations across such diverse political and cultural environments. According to research by historian Maria Pia Pedani in Nome del Gran Signore, Venice simultaneously operated intelligence networks in Christian Europe, the Islamic Ottoman Empire, North African states, and even extended into parts of Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. This required not just linguistic skills and cultural knowledge, but sophisticated understanding of how different societies worked. Venetian agents had to be anthropologists, economists, and political scientists as well as spies. According to training manuals preserved in the Marciana Library, studied by historian Luciano Pezzolo in L'Oro dello Stato, Venice developed comprehensive education programs for intelligence operatives that included languages, regional customs, religious practices, economic systems, and political structures. They were essentially running a medieval university for spies, centuries before any other power had even figured out that systematic intelligence collection was possible. And they protected their sources with methods that would impress modern security professionals. According to cryptographic studies by historian David Kahn in The Codebreakers, Venice developed increasingly sophisticated encryption systems, used multiple communication channels, and implemented strict operational security procedures. Venetian intelligence reports were written in codes that changed regularly, transmitted through routes that were deliberately varied, and protected by layers of security that made interception difficult and decryption nearly impossible. But what I find most remarkable about the Venetian intelligence system is how they integrated it with their commercial and political operations. Unlike modern intelligence agencies, which often operate separately from other government functions, Venetian intelligence was seamlessly woven into their diplomatic, commercial, and military activities. According to historian Frederick Lane's analysis in Venice, a Maritime Republic, a typical Venetian merchant, diplomat, or naval officer was simultaneously conducting their official duties and gathering intelligence, reporting back through channels that ensured information reached the right decision-makers quickly and accurately. They had created what military strategists now call whole-of-government intelligence, a system where every aspect of state activity contributed to information collection and analysis. I'm curious, does this remind you of how modern intelligence agencies operate? Do you see parallels between Venetian methods and contemporary intelligence gathering? What aspects of their approach seem most advanced for the medieval period? Let me know in the comments. I'm always fascinated by how historical innovations connect to modern practices, because that's really what the Venetian intelligence story demonstrates. That information advantage isn't just about having better technology or more resources, it's about creating better systems for collecting, analysing, and using information strategically. The Venetians proved that with systematic approach, careful training, and integrated operations, it's possible to know more about the world than anyone else, and to use that knowledge to maintain strategic advantage for centuries. And they needed that advantage because by the late 15th and early 16th centuries, Venice had reached the absolute peak of its power, wealth, and influence. They controlled more territory, generated more wealth, and wielded more international influence than any other European power except possibly France and Spain. But success on that scale inevitably creates new challenges and new enemies. The very achievements that made Venice dominant also made them a target for every other ambitious power in Europe. And that brings us to Venice's Golden Century, the period from 1450 to 1550, when the Republic reached heights of prosperity and influence that seemed almost impossible to maintain, but somehow managed to do exactly that for 100 extraordinary years. There comes a moment in the life of every great civilization when everything seems to align perfectly, when wealth, power, culture, and opportunity combine to create something so magnificent that it defies belief. For ancient Rome, it was the reign of Augustus. For Britain, it was the Victorian era. For America, it might have been the post-World War II boom. For Venice, that moment lasted an entire century. From 1450 to 1550, Venice achieved something that no other city-state in history has ever managed. They became simultaneously the wealthiest, most powerful, most cultured, and most influential single city on Earth. During this golden century, Venice controlled more international trade than any other power, commanded naval forces that could challenge entire empires, possessed artistic treasures that kings would murder for, and wielded diplomatic influence that could determine the fate of nations. But here's what makes Venice's golden century truly remarkable. They didn't just accumulate power and wealth. They used it to create a civilization so advanced, so sophisticated, and so successful that it wouldn't be equaled anywhere else for centuries. This is the story of Venice at its absolute peak, when a single city ruled the waves and showed the world what human achievement could look like when everything went perfectly right. To understand just how dominant Venice became during its golden century, let me share some numbers that might sound impossible if they weren't carefully documented by contemporary sources. According to economic calculations by historian Fernand Braudel in The Mediterranean and the Mediterranean World, Venice in 1500 generated approximately 1.9 million ducats in annual government revenue. To put that in perspective, that's equivalent to roughly $2, 8 billion in today's purchasing power, and that was just government revenue, not total economic activity. France, the largest and most powerful kingdom in Europe, generated about 4.5 million ducats annually during the same period. But France had a population of approximately 17 million people. Venice had maybe 180,000 residents. Per capita, Venice was generating about 15 times more wealth than France, the richest major power in Europe. According to historian Carlo Cipola's analysis in Before the Industrial Revolution, the average Venetian citizen in 1500 enjoyed a standard of living equivalent to about $35,000 annually in modern terms. That's higher than the current per capita income of most European Union countries today. But individual wealth was just the beginning. According to commercial records preserved in the Venetian State Archives, study by economic historian Frederick Lane, Venice by 1500 controlled approximately 58% of all Mediterranean trade, 73% of Eastern spice imports into Europe, and 67% of the silk trade between Asia and the West. Think about what that means. More than half of all commercial activity in the Mediterranean, the economic heart of the known world, was controlled by a single city. It's like if modern Singapore controlled 60% of all global shipping, or if Wall Street handled 70% of all international finance. Actually, that's not a bad comparison. Venice essentially was the Singapore and Wall Street of the medieval world, except with their own navy to protect their interests, and that navy was spectacular. According to military records analysed by historian John Gilmartin in Gunpowder and Galleys, Venice in 1500 maintained a peacetime fleet of over 300 warships, including 100 galleys specifically designed for combat. During wartime, they could mobilise over 400 ships and 50,000 sailors and marines. To put that in historical perspective, the Spanish Armada that tried to invade England in 1588, considered one of the largest naval forces ever assembled, consisted of 130 ships. Venice maintained a larger standing fleet just for routine operations, but military and economic dominance were only part of what made Venice's golden century extraordinary. According to cultural historian Patricia Fortini Brown in Art and Life in Renaissance Venice, this century from 1450 to 1550 saw Venice commission more major artistic works, construct more architectural masterpieces, and patronise more cultural innovation than any other city in European history. This was the era when Venice attracted artists like Giovanni Bellini, Giorgione, Titian and Tintoretto, painters whose works still define what we think of as Renaissance art. According to art market analysis by historian Michelle O'Malley in The Business of Art, Venetian art patronage during this period generated economic activity equivalent to approximately $500 million annually in today's money. Venice wasn't just buying art, they were essentially funding the Renaissance, and the architectural achievements were equally impressive. According to building records preserved in the Marciana Library, Venice during its golden century completed over 200 major construction projects, including palaces, churches, civic buildings, and infrastructure improvements that transformed the city into what visitors described as the most beautiful place on earth. The famous Rialto Bridge, the Palazzo Ducale renovations, dozens of magnificent churches, and hundreds of palatial residences, essentially everything that makes Venice visually spectacular today, was built or rebuilt during this single century of unprecedented prosperity. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Venice's golden century was how they managed to maintain their dominance across such diverse areas simultaneously. Most civilizations excel in one or two areas, military power or commerce or culture. Venice during its peak was simultaneously the dominant military power in the Mediterranean, the leading commercial centre in the world, the most important artistic patron in Europe, and one of the most sophisticated diplomatic players on the international stage. According to diplomatic historian Garrett Mattingly in Renaissance Diplomacy, Venice during its golden century maintained permanent ambassadors in over 40 cities across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Their diplomatic reports, preserved in the Venetian state archives, provide some of the most detailed and accurate political intelligence from the 15th and 16th centuries. Venetian ambassadors were so well informed, so well connected, and so influential that other European powers routinely sought Venetian mediation for their conflicts. According to Mattingly's analysis, Venice successfully mediated over 30 major international disputes during the Golden Century, earning enormous influence and substantial financial compensation for their diplomatic services. They had essentially become the Switzerland of the Renaissance world, except with a much larger navy and better parties, and the parties were legendary. According to social historian Edward Muir in Civic Ritual in Renaissance Venice, Venice during its golden century hosted diplomatic receptions, cultural festivals, and commercial celebrations that attracted visitors from across the known world. When important foreign dignitaries visited Venice, the city would organize elaborate spectacles involving hundreds of decorated boats, thousands of costume participants, and displays of wealth and sophistication designed to demonstrate Venetian power and culture. According to contemporary accounts, these events regularly left foreign visitors speechless with amazement. It was soft power projection at its most effective, showing the world that Venice wasn't just powerful, but also culturally superior and worthy of respect and emulation. But what I find most impressive about Venice's golden century is how they managed to sustain this level of success for an entire 100 years. Most civilizations have brief periods of exceptional achievement, but maintaining dominance across multiple areas for a century requires extraordinary institutional capabilities, according to analysis by historian Robert Finlay in Politics in Renaissance Venice. Venice during its golden century developed what he calls systematic excellence, institutional systems that consistently produced outstanding results across government, commerce, military affairs, and cultural activities. Their government attracted and promoted the most capable administrators. Their commercial system incentivized and rewarded the most successful entrepreneurs. Their military system trained and equipped the most effective naval forces. Their cultural patronage system identified and supported the most talented artists and intellectuals. It's like they had created a civilization-wide quality control system that ensured excellence in every area of human activity, and the results spoke for themselves. According to comprehensive analysis by historian Carlo Cipolla, Venice during its golden century achieved levels of prosperity, security, and cultural achievement that wouldn't be matched by any single city until the modern era. They had solved problems that civilizations are still struggling with today. How to maintain military security without sacrificing economic prosperity. How to promote cultural achievement without neglecting practical governance. How to exercise international influence without creating enemies, and how to sustain success across multiple generations. I'm curious, when you hear about Venice's golden century achievements, what aspects impress you most? The economic dominance, the military power, the cultural achievements, or the diplomatic influence? Do you see any parallels between Venice's comprehensive success and any modern countries or cities? Let me know what connections you make. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Because when you really study Venice's golden century, you start to understand something important about what peak civilization looks like. It's not just about being the richest, or the strongest, or the most cultured. It's about being all of those things simultaneously, while also being smart enough to maintain that success over time. Venice during its golden century proved that it's possible for human societies to achieve something approaching perfection, at least for a while. But here's the thing about reaching the peak. Once you're at the top, there's really only one direction you can go, and by 1550, Venice had achieved such dominance, accumulated such wealth, and wielded such influence that they had inadvertently created a problem that would eventually destroy them. They had become too successful for their own good. The very achievements that made Venice dominant during its golden century also made them a target for every other ambitious power in Europe. The wealth that funded their magnificent culture also attracted the attention of rivals who wanted to take it for themselves. The trade networks that generated their prosperity also created dependencies that could be exploited by enemies. The diplomatic influence that kept them safe for decades also made them essential players in conflicts that would eventually exhaust their resources. As we move into the next phase of our story, we're going to discover how Venice's golden century success contained the seeds of its own eventual decline. Because while the Venetians had mastered the art of achieving greatness, they were about to learn a much harder lesson: how to defend greatness against enemies who were determined to take it away from them. The story of how Venice dealt with the first serious challenge to their dominance is a tale of innovation, desperation, and a discovery that would change the entire balance of global power. Because while Venice was celebrating their golden century achievements, Portuguese explorers were quietly working on something that would threaten the very foundations of Venetian prosperity. Sometimes the greatest threats come from the most unexpected places, Blockbuster wasn't destroyed by another movie rental chain. It was Netflix, a DVD by mail startup that nobody took seriously. Kodak wasn't killed by another film company. It was digital photography, which they actually invented but failed to embrace. Nokia wasn't beaten by another phone manufacturer. It was Apple, a computer company that had never made phones before. This pattern of disruption, where established giants are toppled not by direct competitors, but by innovators who change the rules entirely, isn't new. In fact, it happened to Venice over 500 years ago, and the story of how it unfolded reads like a masterclass in business disruption, strategic blindness, and the dangerous complacency that comes with being too successful for too long. The disruptor? Portugal. A country so small and poor that Venice had never considered it a serious threat. The innovation? A sea route around Africa that seemed so risky and expensive that Venetian merchants dismissed it as economically impossible. The result? The systematic destruction of the most successful commercial empire in human history. To understand how Portugal managed to challenge Venice's dominance, we need to go back to 1488 and meet a man whose name you've probably never heard, but whose achievement changed the course of world history: Bartolomeu Dias. Dias was a Portuguese explorer who, according to contemporary Portuguese chronicles preserved in the Torre do Tombo archives, and studied by historian Malin Newitt in A History of Portuguese Overseas Expansion, accomplished something that had been considered impossible for over 1,000 years. He sailed around the southern tip of Africa and proved that there was a sea route from Europe to Asia that completely bypassed the Mediterranean. Now you might be thinking, that's interesting, but how is one Portuguese sailor a threat to the mighty Venetian Empire? The answer lies in understanding just how revolutionary this discovery was. For over a millennium, Venice's wealth had been built on one simple geographic fact. If you wanted to trade between Europe and Asia, you had to go through the Mediterranean Sea. And if you went through the Mediterranean, you had to deal with Venice. According to economic analysis by historian Niels Steensgaard in the Asian Trade Revolution, Venice by 1500 was essentially charging what economists call a geographic monopoly tax on all east-west trade. Every pound of pepper, every bolt of silk, every precious gem that travelled between Asia and Europe had to pass through Venetian hands, and Venice took their cut at every step. The profits were enormous because Venice faced no competition. If you wanted Asian goods in Europe, you paid Venetian prices, used Venetian ships, and followed Venetian rules. There was literally no alternative, but Dias had just created one. According to navigation records preserved in Portuguese archives, analysed by historian Bailey Diffie in Foundations of the Portuguese Empire, Dias's route around the Cape of Good Hope was approximately 11,000 miles from Lisbon to India. The traditional Venice-controlled route through the Mediterranean and Red Sea was about 6,000 miles from Venice to India. On paper, the Portuguese route looked like a disaster, almost twice as far, through completely unknown waters, with no established supply bases or friendly ports along the way. But here's where the story gets interesting. Vasco da Gama, following Dias's route in 1497-1499, proved that despite being longer and more dangerous, the Cape route had one overwhelming advantage. It was cheaper. According to da Gama's own account, preserved in the Portuguese National Library and analysed by historian Sanjay Subramaniam in The Career and Legend of Vasco da Gama, a Portuguese expedition could buy spices directly from Asian producers at prices that were 80% lower than what Venice was charging European consumers. Even after accounting for the longer voyage, higher risks, and substantial losses from shipwrecks and disease, Portuguese merchants could sell Asian goods in European markets at prices that undercut Venetian competitors by 40% to 50%, while still making enormous profits. This wasn't just competition, this was economic disruption on a scale that Venice had never experienced. And here's where Venice made their first critical mistake. They didn't take the Portuguese threat seriously. According to diplomatic correspondence preserved in the Venetian state archives, studied by historian Frederick Lane in Venice, a Maritime Republic, when news of da Gama's successful voyage reached Venice in 1499, the Senate's initial reaction was essentially dismissive. They calculated that the Portuguese route was too long, too dangerous, and too expensive to pose a serious threat to Venice's established trade networks. They assumed that European consumers would prefer the reliability and shorter delivery times of the traditional Mediterranean routes. According to Lane's analysis, Venice continued operating on the assumption that they could maintain their dominance through superior infrastructure, better financing, and more reliable service. Basically the same strategies that had worked for centuries. They were thinking like an established incumbent facing a new competitor, not like a monopoly facing a fundamental disruption of their entire business model. The results were catastrophic. According to trade statistics compiled by economist Carlo Cipolla in Before the Industrial Revolution, Venice's share of the European spice trade dropped from approximately 73% in 1500 to less than 35% by 1520. In just 20 years, they had lost more than half of their core business. But the decline wasn't gradual. It was sudden and accelerating. According to revenue records preserved in the Venetian archives, government income from trade taxes fell by over 40% between 1510 and 1530, forcing Venice to increase domestic taxation, reduce public spending, and curtail their naval expansion programs. For the first time in centuries, Venice was experiencing what modern economists call structural economic decline, not a temporary recession, but a permanent reduction in their economic base. And the Portuguese were just getting started. According to colonial records studied by historian Charles Boxer in the Portuguese Seaborne Empire, Portugal by 1520 had established permanent trading posts in India, Southeast Asia, and even China, creating a global commercial network that completely bypassed traditional Mediterranean routes. They had essentially created what we would now recognize as the first global supply chain, with Portuguese ships carrying goods directly from Asian producers to European consumers without any intermediaries. It's exactly the same disruption that Amazon created in retail, cutting out the middlemen, reducing costs, and offering consumers better prices and more convenient service. But here's where Venice's response becomes really instructive for understanding how established powers fail to adapt to disruptive threats. Instead of recognizing that the fundamental economics of their industry had changed and adapting accordingly, Venice doubled down on their traditional strategies. According to policy documents preserved in the Marciana Library, Venice's response to Portuguese competition included attempting to negotiate exclusive agreements with traditional suppliers to block Portuguese access, lobbying other European governments to restrict Portuguese trading rights, investing more heavily in their existing Mediterranean routes to make them more efficient, trying to undercut Portuguese prices through temporary subsidies and price wars. According to business historian Clayton Christensen's analysis in The Innovator's Dilemma, this is exactly the wrong response to disruptive innovation. Established companies typically try to compete on their traditional strengths rather than adapting to the new competitive landscape. Venice was trying to make their old business model work better, instead of recognizing that they needed an entirely new business model. The contrast with Portugal is striking. According to colonial administration records studied by historian Malin Newitt, Portugal didn't just copy existing trading practices, they reinvented them completely. They created new financing mechanisms for long-distance voyages. They developed new navigation technologies for open ocean sailing. They established new diplomatic relationships with Asian rulers. They even created new organizational structures that could manage global commercial operations. Portugal succeeded because they were willing to abandon traditional approaches and invent entirely new ways of doing business. Venice failed because they assumed their traditional advantages would eventually reassert themselves. It's a pattern that repeats throughout business history. According to Harvard Business School studies cited by Clayton Christensen, established market leaders fail to respond effectively to disruption about 75% of the time, usually because they can't abandon the strategies that made them successful in the first place. I'm curious, do you see parallels between Venice's response to Portuguese competition and how modern companies respond to disruption? Have you ever worked for a company that struggled to adapt to new competition or changing market conditions? What similarities do you notice between historical and contemporary business challenges? Because that's really what the Portuguese threat demonstrates, that success can become a trap if it makes you too comfortable with existing methods and too resistant to fundamental change. Venice had been so successful for so long that they couldn't imagine their business model becoming obsolete. They had created systems, institutions, and ways of thinking that were optimized for a world where they controlled the only viable trade routes between East and West. When that world disappeared almost overnight, they found themselves like a chess grandmaster who suddenly discovers that their opponent is playing by completely different rules. According to economic calculations by historian Fernand Braudel in Civilization and Capitalism, Venice's total trade revenue declined by approximately 60% between 1500 and 1550. This wasn't just a business setback, it was an existential crisis that forced Venice to fundamentally reconsider their entire approach to international relations. They could no longer afford to maintain the naval forces that had guaranteed their dominance. They could no longer provide the diplomatic subsidies that had maintained their alliance networks. They could no longer fund the cultural projects that had demonstrated their prestige. For the first time since fleeing from Attila the Hun, over 1,000 years earlier, Venice found themselves on the defensive, struggling to maintain their independence against enemies who were stronger, wealthier, and more militarily capable than they were. And the most dangerous of these enemies was already gathering forces for what would become the longest, most brutal, and most consequential conflict in Venetian history. Because while Venice was dealing with Portuguese commercial competition, the Ottoman Empire was preparing for something much more direct, a systematic military campaign designed to eliminate Venetian power from the eastern Mediterranean entirely. The stage was set for a clash that would determine whether Venice could survive as an independent power, or whether their 1,000-year-old republic would finally succumb to forces that had grown too powerful to resist. What followed was a series of wars so epic, so brutal, and so consequential that they would reshape the entire balance of power between Christianity and Islam for centuries to come. Every civilization eventually faces its defining moment, a test that determines whether it will survive as an independent power or disappear into the pages of history. For Sparta, it was Thermopylae. For Britain, it was the Battle of Britain. For America, it might have been the Civil War or World War II. For Venice, that test lasted 300 years. From 1463 to 1718, Venice fought a series of wars against the Ottoman Empire so brutal, so costly, and so consequential that they literally determined the fate of European civilization. These weren't just territorial disputes or commercial rivalries. They were existential struggles where defeat meant not just the end of Venetian independence, but potentially the end of Christian Europe itself. What makes these wars even more remarkable is that Venice, despite being vastly outnumbered and out-resourced, managed to fight the largest empire in the world to a standstill for 3 centuries. They lost cities, they lost territories, They lost enormous amounts of wealth and blood, but they never lost their independence, and in the process they may have saved Western civilization. This is the story of Venice's longest war, a conflict so epic that it makes World War II look brief by comparison, and so heroic that it deserves to be remembered alongside the greatest military achievements in human history. The first thing you need to understand about the Ottoman-Venetian wars is the sheer scale of what Venice was up against. According to population estimates by historian Stanford Shaw in History of the Ottoman Empire in 1500 controlled territories with approximately 25 million inhabitants, stretched across 3 continents, and commanded resources that dwarfed every other European power combined. Venice, as we've established, had maybe 180,000 people living in the city and its immediate territories. To put this in perspective, it's like if modern-day Luxembourg decided to fight a 300-year war against the combined forces of the United States, China and Russia. The fact that Venice survived this conflict at all is miraculous. The fact that they occasionally won major victories is almost beyond belief. But here's what made these wars different from typical medieval conflicts. Both sides understood that this wasn't just about territory or trade routes. According to Ottoman chronicles preserved in the Topkapi Palace archives, studied by historian Halil İnalcık in the Ottoman Empire, Ottoman strategists viewed Venice as the key to controlling the entire eastern Mediterranean and ultimately conquering Western Europe. From the Ottoman perspective, Venice was the cork in the bottle. As long as Venice controlled key naval positions and maintained their alliance networks, Ottoman expansion into Europe would be limited. Remove Venice, and the path to Rome, Paris and beyond would be wide open. Venice understood this perfectly. According to diplomatic correspondence preserved in the Venetian state archives, analysed by historian Kenneth Seton in The Papacy and the Levant, Venetian leaders consistently framed their conflicts with the Ottomans as a defence of Christian civilization, not just Venetian interests. They positioned themselves as the shield of Europe, and remarkably they managed to play that role effectively for 3 centuries. The first major test came during the War of Cyprus, which began in 1570 when Ottoman forces invaded the Venetian-controlled island. According to military records studied by historian John Gilmartin in Gunpowder and Galleys, the Ottomans committed over 200,000 troops to the Cyprus campaign, a force larger than most European kingdoms could field for any purpose. Venice's response reveals something crucial about how they approach these seemingly impossible military challenges. They couldn't match Ottoman numbers, so they focused on making every Ottoman victory as expensive as possible. The siege of Nicosia, Cyprus's capital, lasted 46 days against overwhelming odds. According to contemporary accounts by the Venetian commander Niccolo Dandolo, preserved in the Marciana Library, the Venetian garrison of approximately 2,500 men held off an Ottoman army of over 80,000 troops for more than 6 weeks. When the city finally fell, according to Ottoman records, the besiegers had suffered casualties approaching 20,000 men. Venice had made the Ottomans pay a price of nearly 8 soldiers for every defender they killed, but the real test came at Famagusta, Cyprus's last major fortress. According to the detailed siege account by historian Michael Mallet in The Military Organization of a Renaissance State, the defense of Famagusta became one of the most heroic and strategically important sieges in military history. The Venetian garrison, commanded by Marcantonio Bragadin, held off an Ottoman army of over 100,000 troops for nearly 11 months, against odds of roughly 40 to 1. The siege consumed enormous Ottoman resources, delayed their expansion plans, and gave the Holy League time to organize the naval campaign that would culminate in the victory at Lepanto that we discussed earlier. When Famagusta finally surrendered in August 1571, according to both Venetian and Ottoman accounts, The Ottomans had lost approximately 50,000 men taking a fortress defended by fewer than 3,000 Venetians. The arithmetic of these conflicts was consistently in Venice's favour. They made every Ottoman victory so costly that even winning was a form of strategic defeat for the empire. But the most remarkable example of Venetian resistance came during the War of Arcandia, which began in 1645 when the Ottomans invaded Crete. According to historian William Miller's comprehensive study, The Latins in the Levant, this conflict lasted 24 years and became the longest siege in military history. 24 years. Think about that for a moment. The Siege of Candia, modern Heraklion, lasted longer than World War I and World War II combined. It consumed the resources of multiple generations, involved forces from across Europe, and became a test of endurance that neither side could afford to lose. According to Ottoman administrative records analysed by historian Daniel Goffman in the Ottoman Empire and Early Modern Europe, the Ottomans committed over 400,000 troops to the Cretan campaign over the course of the war. The financial cost, according to Turkish treasury documents, approached 40 million gold pieces, enough to build an entire new capital city. Venice's strategy during the Cretan War was brilliant in its simplicity. They turned the island into a giant resource drain that slowly bled the Ottoman Empire white. According to Venetian military records, they never attempted to match Ottoman numbers. Instead, they focused on making the occupation as expensive and difficult as possible. They supported guerrilla warfare by Cretan civilians. They maintained naval superiority around the island, making Ottoman supply lines vulnerable and expensive. They brought in military engineers from across Europe to design fortress systems that maximized defensive advantages. Most importantly, they turned the conflict into a European crusade, securing financial and military support from France, the Papal States, and other Catholic powers who recognized that Venice was fighting for all of them. According to diplomatic historian Kenneth Seton, Venice during the Cretan War received subsidies, volunteers, and military supplies worth approximately 15 million ducats from other European powers, roughly equivalent to $22 billion in today's money. Europe understood that if Venice fell, they would be next, and the results justified that support. According to military analysis by historian John Gilmartin, the Cretan War consumed approximately 30% of Ottoman military resources for nearly a quarter century, significantly slowing Ottoman expansion into Europe and giving other European powers time to strengthen their own defences. When Venice finally lost Crete in 1669, it wasn't because they had been defeated militarily, it was because they had been financially exhausted. According to treasury records preserved in the Venetian archives, Venice had spent approximately 4 million ducats annually on the Cretan defence, roughly equivalent to their entire pre-war government budget. They had literally spent themselves into near bankruptcy defending European Christianity. But here's what I find most remarkable about these Ottoman wars. Venice never gave up. According to historian Frederick Lane's analysis in Venice, a Maritime Republic, Venice continued fighting Ottoman expansion for another 50 years after losing Crete, participating in the Great Turkish War, 1683-1699, and achieving one of their greatest military victories during the Reconquest of the Morea, Peloponnese, in the 1680s. By this point, Venice was a shadow of its former economic power. They could no longer afford to maintain the massive fleets that had once dominated the Mediterranean. Their commercial empire had been largely dismantled by Portuguese competition and Ottoman pressure. But they kept fighting. According to military records, Venetian forces during the Morean War, 1684-1699, achieved a series of stunning victories against Ottoman armies, recapturing territories that had been lost for generations and proving that Venetian military competence remained formidable even when their economic resources were limited. The Venetian reconquest of Athens in 1687, led by Francesco Morosini, was particularly symbolic. According to contemporary accounts preserved in the Venetian archives, when Venetian forces entered the Parthenon for the first time in over 200 years, they found Ottoman ammunition stored inside the ancient temple. During the bombardment that drove out the Ottoman garrison, a Venetian cannonball ignited the ammunition depot and partially destroyed the Parthenon, the same building that had survived intact for over 2,000 years. It was a perfect metaphor for these wars. In order to save European civilization, Venice was sometimes forced to damage the very cultural heritage they were trying to protect. I'm curious, when you hear about these centuries-long conflicts, what strikes you most? The incredible endurance of both sides, the massive scale of the battles, or the broader significance for European history? Have you ever wondered what would have happened if Venice had been defeated early in these wars? Drop a comment and let me know your thoughts. Because that's really what the Ottoman Wars demonstrate, that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that prevent defeats. Venice may have lost territory, wealth, and ultimately their commercial empire, but they succeeded in their most crucial mission. They prevented Ottoman domination of the Mediterranean and gave European civilization time to develop the resources and alliances necessary to resist Islamic expansion. According to strategic analysis by historian Geoffrey Parker in The Military Revolution, Venice's 3-century resistance to Ottoman expansion was one of the decisive factors that prevented Islamic conquest of Europe. By making Ottoman victories so expensive and time-consuming, Venice disrupted Ottoman strategic timelines and allowed other European powers to strengthen themselves. The cost was enormous. According to economic calculations by historian Carlo Cipolla, Venice spent approximately 65% of their total government revenues on military expenses between 1500 and 1700. They transformed themselves from a commercial empire into essentially a military republic dedicated to the defense of Christian Europe. They had sacrificed their golden age prosperity for a higher purpose, the survival of Western civilization. But by 1718, when Venice finally signed the Treaty of Passarowitz, ending their last major war with the Ottomans, the world had changed dramatically. The Ottoman Empire, exhausted by centuries of expensive European wars, was beginning its own long decline. Portugal and other Atlantic powers had permanently altered global trade patterns. New military technologies were making Venice's traditional naval advantages obsolete. Venice had successfully defended European Christianity, but in doing so they had transformed themselves into something completely different from the commercial republic that had once ruled the waves. As we approach the final chapters of our story, we're entering an era when Venice faced a new kind of threat, not from Islamic empires or Portuguese competitors, but from the revolutionary forces that would reshape all of Europe. The story of how Venice confronted the age of Napoleon is a tale of political survival, diplomatic genius, and ultimately the end of one of history's most remarkable civilizations. Throughout history, some of the greatest empires have fallen in spectacular battles. Rome sacked by barbarians, Constantinople stormed by Ottoman cannons, the Aztec Empire conquered in brutal warfare. These dramatic endings make for compelling stories because they match the epic scale of what was destroyed. But sometimes the most powerful civilizations die not with thunderous violence, but with a whisper of surrender. Sometimes 1,000 years of independence ends not because of military defeat, but because of political calculation. Sometimes the mightiest republics simply give up. On May 12, 1797, Napoleon Bonaparte achieved something that Ottoman sultans Spanish kings and Austrian emperors had failed to accomplish in centuries of warfare. He conquered the Venetian Republic in less than 24 hours without firing a single shot, without losing a single soldier, and without even entering Venetian territory. How do you destroy a civilization that had survived for over a millennium using nothing but words and strategic positioning? The answer reveals something profound about power, politics, and the tragic reality that even the greatest empires can simply choose to stop existing. To understand how Napoleon managed this impossible feat, we need to go back to Venice in 1796, a republic that was still technically independent, but bore little resemblance to the Golden Empire we've been following throughout our story. According to demographic studies by historian Frederick Lane in Venice, a Maritime Republic, Venice by 1796 had a population of approximately 140,000 people, actually smaller than it had been 3 centuries earlier. The great merchant families that had once dominated international commerce were mostly reduced to managing local real estate and small-scale regional trade. The arsenal, which had once produced the world's most advanced warships, was operating at perhaps 10% of its historical capacity. According to naval records preserved in the Venetian State Archives, analysed by historian Robert Davis in Shipbuilders of the Venetian Arsenal, Venice in 1796 possessed fewer than 40 functional warships, a fleet that would have been considered inadequate even for a minor regional power. Politically, Venice was still nominally a republic, but according to constitutional analysis by historian James Grubb in When Myths Lose Power, the Great Council had essentially become a closed aristocratic club. The same families that had competed for power and honour during Venice's golden age were now mainly competing for the privilege of managing decline. But here's what makes Venice's situation in 1796 truly tragic. They weren't actually finished. According to financial records studied by historian Jean Georgelin in Venise au siècle des Lumières, Venice still possessed substantial liquid wealth, maintained profitable commercial operations, and could have potentially rebuilt their power if they had been willing to embrace major political and economic reforms. The problem wasn't that Venice couldn't survive, it was that the Venetian leadership had lost the will to do what survival required. And then Napoleon appeared. According to military historian David Chandler in The Campaigns of Napoleon, Napoleon's Italian campaign of 1796-1797 was one of the most strategically brilliant military operations in history. In less than a year, he had defeated multiple Austrian armies, conquered most of northern Italy, and established French dominance over the region that had been contested by great powers for centuries. But Napoleon's approach to Venice reveals something crucial about how he understood power. According to diplomatic correspondence preserved in the French National Archives, studied by historian Paul Schroeder in The Transformation of European Politics, Napoleon never intended to conquer Venice through direct military assault. Instead, he engineered a situation where Venice would be forced to choose between fighting a war they couldn't win or surrendering their independence voluntarily. The setup was masterful. In April 1797, Napoleon positioned French armies on Venice's mainland territories, ostensibly pursuing Austrian forces but actually creating a strategic encirclement of the Republic. According to Venetian diplomatic records, analysed by historian John Norwich in A History of Venice, French forces accidentally occupied several Venetian cities while chasing Austrian troops, then politely refused to leave. Meanwhile, Napoleon began supporting pro-French revolutionary movements within Venetian territories, providing weapons, funding and organisational support to local groups that demanded democratic reforms and alignment with revolutionary France. According to contemporary accounts by the French diplomat Antoine César Julien, preserved in the French diplomatic archives, Napoleon was essentially offering Venice a choice: accept French protection, and maintain nominal independence under French guidance, or face internal revolution supported by French military power. The genius of this strategy was that it made military resistance seem both impossible and unnecessary. Venice couldn't fight France without risking internal revolt. They couldn't suppress internal revolt without French military support, and French military support came with political conditions that amounted to surrender. According to the memoirs of Venetian nobleman Alvise Mocenigo, preserved in the Marciana Library and analysed by historian Gerhard Rösch in Venedig und das Reich, the Venetian Senate spent weeks debating their options, but every discussion led to the same conclusion. They had no good choices. They could fight France and lose everything immediately, or they could negotiate with France and lose everything gradually while maintaining the fiction of independence. On May 9, 1797, according to official records preserved in the Venetian state archives, a French naval squadron appeared in the Adriatic and began stopping Venetian merchant ships. When a Venetian patrol boat attempted to assert territorial rights, French forces opened fire, killing several Venetian sailors. Napoleon used this incident, which his own forces had provoked, as justification for demanding immediate satisfaction from the Venetian government. According to the ultimatum preserved in both French and Venetian archives, Napoleon demanded that Venice arrest and punish the officials responsible for attacking French forces, pay substantial reparations, and accept French occupation of Venetian territories as guarantee against future aggression. The ultimatum gave Venice exactly 24 hours to respond. According to the detailed account by historian Paul Ginsborg in Daniele Mani and the Venetian Revolution, what happened next was one of the most pathetic scenes in European political history. The Venetian Senate met in emergency session to consider Napoleon's demands. According to the official minutes, preserved in the state archives, the debate lasted less than 4 hours. No one seriously proposed military resistance. No one suggested appealing to other European powers for support. No one even recommended trying to negotiate better terms. According to the account by Senator Alvise Mocenigo, the discussion focused almost entirely on how to surrender in the most dignified manner possible, while preserving as many privileges as they could for the noble families who had governed Venice for centuries. On May 12, 1797, exactly 100 years after Venice had first been established as an independent political entity, the Great Council voted to dissolve itself and surrender all governmental authority to Napoleon. The vote wasn't even close. According to the official records, 512 senators voted to surrender, 20 voted to resist, and 5 abstained. Think about that for a moment. A republic that had survived Attila the Hun, the Crusades, the Ottoman Wars, and Portuguese commercial competition simply voted itself out of existence, rather than face the uncertainty of continued independence. According to eyewitness accounts preserved in contemporary diaries, studied by historian Jonathan Keats in The Siege of Venice, when news of the surrender spread through the city, the reaction wasn't outrage or grief, it was resignation. Most Venetians, according to these accounts, seemed almost relieved that the uncertainty was over. After decades of economic decline and political drift, ending the Republic felt less like a catastrophe than like finally acknowledging reality. But here's what makes this moment truly heartbreaking. According to military analysis by historian Christopher Duffy in Eagles Over the Alps, Venice probably could have successfully resisted French conquest if they had been willing to accept the costs. Napoleon's forces in northern Italy were overextended, facing potential Austrian counterattacks and dependent on supply lines that could have been disrupted by determined Venetian naval action. A prolonged resistance, especially if supported by Austria or Britain, might have forced Napoleon to negotiate rather than fight. Venice had survived much worse situations through determination, strategic thinking, and willingness to pay the price of independence. But by 1797, according to historian William Bousma's analysis in Venice and the Defence of Republican Liberty, the Venetian leadership had lost something essential, the belief that their independence was worth fighting for. They had become what political scientists call a hollow state, maintaining the forms of sovereignty while lacking the substance of political will necessary to defend it. I'm curious, what do you think about Venice's surrender? Do you see it as a pragmatic decision to avoid unnecessary suffering, or as a tragic failure of leadership and will? Have you ever been in situations where giving up seemed easier than continuing to fight? Drop a comment and let me know your thoughts. These questions about when to persevere and when to surrender are still very relevant today, because that's really what Venice's end teaches us. That civilizations don't always die because they're militarily defeated or economically exhausted. Sometimes they die because they simply lose the collective will to continue existing as independent entities. According to the final official act of the Venetian Republic, preserved in the state archives and analysed by historian Gerhard Rösch, the last doge, Ludovico Manin, symbolically removed his ceremonial cap and handed it to his servant, saying, "I will not be needing this anymore." With that simple gesture, one of the longest-lived republics in human history ceased to exist. Napoleon, according to his own memoirs, later described the conquest of Venice as one of his easiest victories. He had eliminated a potential enemy, gained control of valuable territory, and acquired enormous wealth from Venetian treasuries, all without the expense and risk of military conquest. He had proven that in the modern world, political will was more important than military strength, and that even the most historically successful civilizations could be destroyed if they lost confidence in their own right to exist. But the story of Venice doesn't end with Napoleon's conquest, because the ideas, institutions and achievements that Venice had developed over 100 years of independence didn't disappear when their government did. In our final chapter, we're going to explore something that might surprise you: how Venice's legacy continues to shape the modern world in ways that most people never realize. From the skyscrapers of Manhattan to the Constitution in your pocket, from international banking to global trade networks, the innovations that Venice pioneered are still influencing how our world works today. The Republic may have ended in 1797, but the Venetian impact on human civilization was just beginning to spread across the globe. As you drift off to sleep tonight, I want you to consider something remarkable. You've been living in Venice's world your entire life, and you probably never knew it. That credit card in your wallet? Venice invented standardized international banking. The insurance on your car? Venice created the first maritime insurance policies. The way your 401k diversifies investments across multiple assets. Venice pioneered portfolio theory 5 centuries before modern finance discovered it. The checks and balances in American government that prevent any one branch from gaining too much power. Venice perfected those systems 800 years before the founding fathers were even born. The skyscrapers of Manhattan, built on bedrock but designed to withstand wind and seismic forces. They use engineering principles that Venice developed for building on water, the global supply chains that deliver goods from Asia to American stores. Venice created the first version of that system in the medieval period. Even the idea that a small, innovative society can compete with much larger powers through superior technology, better organization, and strategic thinking. That's pure Venice, and it became the foundational myth of American entrepreneurship. According to economic historian Fernand Braudel's analysis in Civilization and Capitalism, Venice didn't just create successful businesses, They invented the institutional framework that makes modern capitalism possible. The Venetian innovations in double-entry bookkeeping, studied by accounting historian Luca Pacioli in his seminal work, became the foundation for every accounting system used by modern corporations. When you look at a company's balance sheet today, you're seeing the direct descendant of systems developed by Venetian merchants in the 13th century. Venice's approach to international trade law, according to legal historian Roberto Cessi's research in Storia del Commercio Veneziano, established principles of contract enforcement, dispute resolution, and commercial arbitration that were adopted by every major trading nation and eventually became the foundation of modern international commercial law. The World Trade Organization, the International Chamber of Commerce, and even the commercial courts that handle billion-dollar business disputes all operate using legal principles that Venice pioneered centuries ago. But perhaps Venice's most profound influence on the modern world lies in how they thought about government and society. According to political scientist Robert Dahl's analysis in How Democratic is the American Constitution, the American founding fathers studied Venetian political theory extensively when designing the US Constitution. The concept of separation of powers, the system of checks and balances, even the idea of a Senate as a deliberative upper house, all of these were influenced by Venetian models. James Madison's famous observation that if men were angels, no government would be necessary, reflects a fundamentally Venetian understanding of political power, that institutions must be designed to prevent corruption and abuse, regardless of the virtue of individual leaders. The Electoral College, whatever you think of it, is based partly on Venetian ideas about balancing direct democracy with institutional stability. The Supreme Court's role as an independent check on legislative and executive power mirrors the Venetian Council of Ten's function as a constitutional guardian. According to historian William Bousmer in Venice and the Defense of Republican Liberty, Venice proved that republics could be both stable and effective, a demonstration that directly influenced American political thought and helped make the American experiment possible. But Venice's influence extends far beyond government and economics. According to architectural historian Deborah Howard in Venice in the East, Venetian innovations in construction, urban planning, and engineering have influenced city design worldwide. The concept of mixed-use development, combining residential, commercial, and civic functions in integrated urban spaces, was pioneered in Venice and became the model for successful city centres from Paris to Singapore. Venice's approach to managing tourism, cultural preservation, and economic development in a constrained physical environment has become a case study for cities worldwide dealing with similar challenges. According to urban planning studies by historian Elizabeth Kruse-Pavan in Venice Triumphant, modern cities from Amsterdam to Hong Kong have adopted Venetian strategies for balancing economic growth with historical preservation and environmental sustainability. Even Silicon Valley operates on principles that Venice would recognize. According to technology historian Walter Isaacson in The Innovators, the Silicon Valley model of small networked companies competing and collaborating simultaneously mirrors the structure of medieval Venetian commerce, the venture capital system that funds American innovation. It's based directly on the Venetian model of syndicated investment, where multiple families would pool resources to fund trading voyages too risky for any single investor. The emphasis on merit over birth, the willingness to embrace immigrants and outsiders, the focus on practical results rather than theoretical purity, these Silicon Valley values are pure Venice. According to business historian Alfred Chandler in Scale and Scope, Venice essentially created the template for what we now call knowledge economy, an economic system based on information, innovation, and strategic thinking rather than natural resources or cheap labor. They proved that small societies with limited physical resources could compete with much larger powers by being smarter, more flexible, and more innovative. It's the same competitive strategy that has allowed countries like South Korea, Singapore, and Israel to become global powers despite their size. The Venetian story also offers crucial lessons for modern America. According to historian Paul Kennedy's analysis in The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, Venice's decline demonstrates both the opportunities and dangers that come with global dominance. Venice shows us what's possible when a society commits to excellence, embraces diversity, and maintains institutions that reward merit and innovation. But it also shows us what can happen when success breeds complacency, when dominant powers fail to adapt to changing circumstances, and when societies lose confidence in their own values and systems. The parallels between Venice's golden age and America's 20th century dominance are striking. Both societies achieved unprecedented prosperity through technological innovation, military strength, and global commercial networks. Both became magnets for talent and capital from around the world. Both created political and economic systems that other societies tried to emulate. But Venice's story also serves as a warning about the importance of continued adaptation, strategic thinking, and institutional renewal. According to Kennedy's analysis, great powers typically decline not because they're conquered by enemies, but because they fail to adapt their systems and strategies to changing global conditions. The question for modern America, and for every other society that hopes to remain relevant in a rapidly changing world, is whether we can learn from Venice's successes without repeating their mistakes. Can we maintain the innovative spirit that made us dominant while avoiding the complacency that led to Venice's decline? Can we embrace the diversity and openness that generates prosperity while maintaining the social cohesion necessary for effective governance? Can we adapt our institutions to new challenges while preserving the values and principles that made them successful? Venice's story suggests that these challenges are difficult but not impossible. They maintained their independence for over 1,000 years, adapted to countless changes in technology and geopolitics, and created institutions that influenced human civilization for centuries after their political power ended. They proved that human societies can achieve something approaching greatness, not perfection, but a level of achievement that inspires and influences people for generations. And that's really what the Venice story is about. The possibility of human excellence. The idea that with intelligence, courage, and commitment to the common good, people can create societies that are simultaneously prosperous, free, and just. Venice wasn't perfect. No human society ever is. They made mistakes. They sometimes acted selfishly, and they eventually succumbed to challenges they couldn't overcome. But for over 1,000 years they showed the world what was possible when human creativity, ambition, and cooperation combined in pursuit of something greater than individual success. Their lagoon may have become a tourist destination, but their ideas became the foundation of the modern world. As you close your eyes tonight, remember that you're the inheritor of Venetian innovations, the beneficiary of Venetian political wisdom, and the heir to a tradition of human achievement that stretches back over a millennium. The refugees who fled to muddy islands in 452 AD couldn't have imagined that their descendants would influence how people live, work, and govern themselves more than 1,500 years later. But they planted seeds of innovation, excellence, and republican virtue that are still growing today. Venice may have ended as a political entity, but as an idea, as proof of what human societies can achieve when they commit to being their best selves, Venice is eternal. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through the rise and fall of one of history's most remarkable civilizations. I hope Venice's story has inspired you, challenged your assumptions, and maybe even given you some new insights into the world we live in today. The story of human achievement is filled with civilizations that rose from nothing, created something magnificent, and left legacies that outlasted their political power. Venice is just one of these incredible stories, and there are so many others waiting to be told. So rest well, dream of floating cities and merchant princes, and remember that the impossible becomes possible when people decide to make it happen. And keep an eye out for our next journey together, because history is full of stories that will change how you see the world, and I can't wait to share them with you. Sweet dreams, fellow travellers through time, until we meet again in the pages of history.